Okay, thank you. We are now in public session. Before I begin, can I please remind members and witnesses please to turn off mobile phones. There is an interference with transmission of the sound quality of the meeting. So thank you for that. Now I'd like to obviously welcome today Mr Seamus Coffey, who is the chairperson of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, and we thank you and welcome you for coming in to us for our session today. You're accompanied by Sebastian Barnes, Council Member, Michael Tushy, Council Member, and Professor Michael McMahon, Council Member, and Eddie Casey, who is with you also here today. So we thank you all for coming in, and we have a number of your colleagues who are seated behind you, which is Niall Conroy, Killian Carroll and Frederica Vogler, and we thank you as well for being present. Obviously, twice a year we have this opportunity as part of the EU semester to meet with IFAC to consider issues raised in the Fiscal Assessment Report. This was published this morning, and it raises a number of issues very directly relating to our committee's work in terms of our budget scrutiny role. So we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Can I just do the normal statement on privilege to you, and just to make you aware that you're advised by virtue of section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to the committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter to only qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected to the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or an entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So with that piece of housekeeping done, I'd like to thank you for attending and to ask you, Mr Coffey, if you would now make your opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you and the members of the committee for inviting us to meet and for the opportunity to discuss our latest fiscal assessment report. As you've outlined, joining me today are Council members Mr Sebastian Barnes, Mr Michael Tutty and Professor Michael McMahon, with Michael being our newest Council member. And at this stage I'd also like to put on the record of the committee a recognition of the positive contribution made by Dr Ida Carney during her previous 4 years as a member of the Fiscal Council. Also joining me are Mr Eddie Casey, our Chief Economist and Head of Secretariat, as well as members of the Council Secretariat, Mr Niall Conroy, Ms Frederica Vogler and Mr Killian Carroll. And we continue to value these engagements. The Council's latest report, published today, covers all aspects of the Council's mandate as set out in the Fiscal Responsibility Acts of 2012 and 2013. It is important to note that the Council's mandate does not cover commenting on the choice of individual tax measures or spending items priorities, but rather to comment on the overall fiscal stance. The domestic Irish economy has shown continuing strong growth since about 2013. It has recovered from a deep crisis and is now operating near capacity. This is most visible in the labour market, with the unemployment rate falling to about 4.5%. The percentage of the population employed in prime age groups, those aged between 25 and 54, was above its pre-crisis peak at the end of last year. Efforts up until 2015 to turn around the large budget deficit were successful. The government's debt ratios are on a downward path, creditworthiness is improved, and the budget balance appears to be close to a balanced position when the effects of the cycle are accounted for. However, the outlook for the Irish economy is unusually uncertain. On the one hand, the domestic economy could continue to outperform. It could significantly overheat if housing construction expands at a faster rate than is expected, or if migration flows and credit growth rates follow more typical patterns for a mature phase of expansion in the Irish economy. On the other hand, there are severe downside risks. A disorderly Brexit poses profound risks to the economy and public finances, as do changes to the international tax environment, an escalation of protectionist measures, the onset of a cyclical downturn in major trading partners, and adverse financial developments, including those possibly arising from Italy. Since 2015, there has been little progress to improve Ireland's budget balance excluding interest costs, and Ireland's net debt ratio remains the 5th highest in the OECD when measured appropriately. Reflecting this, creditworthiness is still vulnerable to rapid changes. Government spending growth has accelerated in recent years, and the government has also allowed a pattern of spending drift to take hold within the year. Annual non-interest spending rose by 2.4 billion in 2017, by €5.2 billion in 2018, and Budget 2019 set out plans for a rise of €4.5 billion this year. The pace of spending growth has risen from 4.5% in 2015 to 6.7% in 2018. Spending increases within the year, over and above what was originally budgeted for, have also contributed to a faster than planned pace of expansion. For 2018, there was more evidence of this. In October, the Department estimated that gross voted spending would be about €1 billion higher than planned for the year. As it turned out, it was closer to €1.3 billion higher than planned, with additional spending increases occurring in the final months of the year. The overruns are evident even more so in the general government data published by the CSO. The Council's critical assessment last November, for instance, was based on a 2018 general government expenditure increase that was £500 million lower than shown by the eventual CSO outturn data published in April, once officers are excluded. On this basis, a within-year spending revision of €1.9 billion is evident for 2018, compared to the SPU 2018 estimates. The additional €0.3 billion overrun appears to have been driven by 1. Anticipated underspends in non-health areas not having materialised. These were factored into the budget day estimates for 2018. And 2, higher than estimated social payments, including health service, housing assistance and other social protection schemes. The Council has adopted a new principles-based approach that aims to make the assessment of the fiscal rules simpler and more robust, including using the Department of Finance's alternative measures of the cycle. On this basis, the objective of a structural balance of no worse than minus 0.5% of GDP was achieved in 2018, as the structural balance was estimated to be plus 0.2% of GDP. However, there was a significant deviation or deterioration in the structural balance in 2018, and government spending breached the limit for the spending rule in 2018. This reinforces the Council's view that the net spending increases in recent years have not been conducive to prudent economic and budgetary management. The lack of progress comes against a backdrop of significant favourable factors. The economy has experienced a continued cyclical upswing, meaning lower unemployment-related payments and higher tax revenues, while corporation tax has surged. Both of these factors are likely to prove temporary. The Council report shows that some €3 billion to €6 billion of the €10.4 billion corporate tax receipts received in 2018 could be considered excess. In other words, beyond what we projected based on the economy's underlying performance and based on historical or international norms. Unlike typical revenue windfalls, these gains could persist for a number of years before reversals could be expected. They also represent a net injection to the Irish economy, given that foreign-owned multinational enterprises contribute 4/5 of corporation tax receipts. As much of the improvement in government revenues in recent years may be cyclical or temporary, this suggests that the structural position, by looking through these effects, has deteriorated. The Council assesses that the government should be cautious, reflecting the risks associated with a hard Brexit, the reliance on corporation tax, possibilities of overheating, and the rapid rise in spending between 2017 and 2019. For 2019, the government should stick to its existing plans as contained in SPU 2019. This means that no additional within-year increases, including the payment of a Christmas bonus for weekly social welfare recipients, should be introduced without offsetting measures elsewhere. Further slippages, which imply a looser fiscal stance and contribute to overheating pressures, should be avoided. To stem the increased reliance on corporation tax receipts, any additional unexpected receipts should be allocated to a prudence account during the year and into the rainy day fund or elsewhere. For 2020, the government should stick to its plans as set out in SPU 2019. This would imply some €2.8 billion of budgetary measures for 2020. This includes amounts already earmarked for increases in public investment, public sector pay, provision to cater for demographic changes, and for assumed tax cuts for 2020. This approach would mean minimal new tax and spending measures on budget day. If further discretionary measures are to be introduced beyond SPU 2019 plans, then the government should introduce additional revenue-raising measures or scale back planned spending increases and tax cuts to preserve overall sustainability. A smaller expansion than the €2.8 billion would also be desirable, again recognising the severe risks now faced. This could include not using the €0.6 billion that is currently set aside for assumed tax cuts and unallocated spending increases. The government's budgetary plans for later years lack credibility. Specifically, the medium-term spending forecasts are based on technical assumptions that look unrealistic as they do not reflect either likely future policies or the future cost of meeting existing commitments. The projections imply an implausible slowdown in spending growth, which leads to increasing surpluses in later years. For example, gross voted expenditure is assumed, as a technical assumption, to grow at 2.5% per annum over the period 2020 to 2023. The spending growth forecast for the later years will also be insufficient to cover the Council's estimates of the standstill scenario of maintaining current public services levels and income supports given demographic and price pressures. The Government needs a credible strategy for the medium term. A better approach to budgetary planning could be built around 4 key elements. First, the Government's debt ratio target should be revisited. It should be lowered to reflect Ireland's volatile growth rates. It should be restated as a percentage of modified GNI star. It should be clarified as either a ceiling or a target, and it should have clear staging posts. Second, a clear statement of the sustainable growth rate that net policy spending can grow at is needed. This could be informed by the Department's alternative estimates of the potential output, but any approach should try to correct for the risks of pro-cyclical bias present in such estimates. Third, departmental 3-year expenditure ceilings should be reframed around this medium-term growth rate, and forecasts should be more realistic. The current ceilings are evidently not working. A better approach would see more realistic spending plans set out in advance and a strengthening of subsequent spending controls and monitoring. Fourth, a budgetary position less reliant on corporation tax receipts should be an overarching principle guiding fiscal policy in the coming years. Using a prudence account, as the Council suggests, could help to achieve this. To conclude, I thank the committee again for providing us with the opportunity to attend here today. I look forward to taking questions and hearing the views of members.
Thank you very much for your opening statement there. I have a number of deputies who have already indicated to me to attend. So, as we discussed in our private session, we'll have an initial round where all deputies have 5 minutes in terms of questions. Thank you. Deputy McGrath, you're first up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to welcome Mr. Coffey and his team, and again to commend you on a very comprehensive report. There's a huge amount of data and analysis there that will take some time to go through, but compliments to the team for all the work that went into it. Just 3 areas, if I may, in the short time available to me that I'd like to cover. One is just in relation to corporation tax and your conclusion that somewhere between 3 and 6 billion euro of the 10.4 billion euro of receipts that we collected in 2018 could be considered excess, so outside of the normal economic cycle and the underlying performance of the economy. So in essence, in simple terms, are you saying that we cannot rely on that revenue reoccurring on an annual basis year in, year out?
So I suppose our view is that the performance of CT has clearly been exceptional, and we're trying to get some handle on the size of that outperformance. And if you look at the historical norms and maybe the performance of the economy, it would suggest that a significant share of it is not explained by the historical patterns or the performance of the domestic economy. And because it has risen so quickly, yes, it could be something that could fall as dramatically as that in the recent years. It should be recognised that these aren't forecasts or projections. Like, these are just sort of a modelling approach to see, well, how much of an excess is there. But our view is that we shouldn't be reliant on receiving these revenues over the medium term. They could persist for a number of years, but it's likely that there will be some reversal at some stage. So having our public finances very much dependent on these potentially temporary receipts is something that should be avoided. So we're not predicting such a catastrophic collapse in corporation tax, but our analysis suggests that if we were to weigh up and say how much of it is in excess, it is quite significant. So if you go back to the end of 2014, the start of 2015, the forecast at the time would have been for corporation tax receipts around 5 billion. As it is, as you say, those receipts are around 10 billion. So our estimate of the excess isn't really different to the huge outperformance we've seen relative to forecasts over the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay. And given that the receipts received to date have been banked as such and commitments have been made on the back of them, your proposal for a prudence account, so can you explain how that would work going forward? So let's say there's an estimate of corporation tax receipts for 2020. Is it only the excess above that then that you would say should be put into a prudence account and a rainy day fund?
Yeah, so you'd be looking at what the forecast is for 2020, what the profile during the year is, and then if there's outperformance relative to that, that money should be taken out of the exchequer account. What we've seen in the last number of years is that these excess receipts, these outperformances, have been remained in the exchequer account, and by and large they've been used to mask the overruns and the additional spending we've seen across a range of areas, more specifically in health. So again, overall terms, if you look at the budget balance and the exchequer balance, it looks to be a reasonably positive position. But one issue there is that it's been hugely flattered by these corporation tax receipts. So if we were to take those out and set them aside, put them into a prudence account, and then maybe have them available to use elsewhere, any overruns in health and other areas would become much more visible, and actually would be require decisions to be made that we haven't seen over the last number of years.
Can I ask you, Mr. Coffey, how disruptive to the public finances and to the economy do you believe a disorderly Brexit would be? So all of the government's projections in the Stability Programme update and so on are based on the central case scenario, an orderly Brexit by the end of 2020. But can you just characterise for us, if that doesn't transpire and nobody can predict what will happen, what is the Council's assessment of what the impact would be on the public finances and the economy of a disorderly or a crash-out Brexit? So
there's potential for a disorderly or crash-out Brexit, as you refer to it, to be a very negative impact on the public finances. So our analysis is based on some of the scenarios done by the Central Bank and the ESRI about the impact on Irish growth, and then carrying that through to the impact on the public finances. So one consequence would be a significant opening up of a deficit if there was to be a dramatic slowdown in the Irish economy, and increase perhaps in unemployment-related spending, a drop in tax revenues, and over a period of 2 or 3 years that deficit could become quite significant and perhaps threaten some of the targets and ceilings set out in the Stability and Growth Pact. Equally, we could see that our debt ratio that's currently in a downward projection, that mightn't continue. And in fact, in a very adverse scenario, you could begin to see the debt ratio begin to rise again, and maybe some of the benign financial conditions we've seen in recent years could actually reverse. I think one thing that's happened over the past number of years is that financial markets have paid very little attention to Ireland. We're small, and they'll just look at a couple of headline numbers, and if one of those headline numbers that they focus on is debt to GDP, they may get a very misleading view of Ireland. And if our debt ratios are beginning to start to rise, and they were to start to look a bit closer and say, well, no, it's not debt to GDP, it's debt to GNI star. And this was to be heading for 100% and continuing to rise. Those benign borrowing conditions we've seen over the last number of years could reverse quite quickly. So not only do we have a large debt to refinance, in the case of a hard Brexit, it could be a large deficit to finance. And it may be that the benign financial conditions we find ourselves in now would no longer prevail. So one of the consequences of recent fiscal policy is that we haven't given ourselves sufficient room to absorb the potentially very large shock that a hard Brexit could present to the Irish economy and to the public finances.
Okay, finally for now, Chair, just on the issue of the medium-term fiscal projections, you say the government's medium-term plans are not credible. So up until recently, we only had 3-year projections on the fiscal side. In the SPU in April, we got 5-year projections. And you make the point that current spending, there's a technical assumption underpinning it, that it will grow by 2.5%. When you consider we have a national planning framework out to 2040, we have a national development plan out to 2027, we have a pretty good handle of the demographic changes that are coming and are well on the way, and looking at the current pressures in areas of health such as home care, caring for the elderly, nursing home care and so on. Can you just talk us through how you reach that conclusion that those plans are not credible, and when you look at the fact that, and you dealt with this in your report, the ratio of workers to pensioners is going to change significantly in the next 20 to 30 years, fewer workers paying into the tax pot to fund pensions and so on. Do you think that we need a radical overhaul of how we do medium and indeed longer term fiscal projections and budgeting?
If I could respond on that. I mean, our main difficulty with the medium-term projections is that they are really technical projections rather than policy projections, that the expenditure, the current expenditure, is being projected to grow by a fixed amount of 2.5%, rather than the government looking at what are we expecting to do over the next number of years. And that 2.5 is so much below what has been happening in recent years, and indeed below what the economy can reasonably bear over that time. We have seen over time that projections like that are never followed through on. They are always exceeded substantially in the next budget and the ones after it. So we are really looking for realistic type projections that take account of the realities, not only the realities of the demographics and inflation, but the realities of policy changes that any government will be likely to introduce. But that doesn't happen. I must say, in my time in the Department of Finance, it never happened either. So I'm preaching things that I wasn't able to do either. But we have been, the Department of Finance and the government have been developing forecasts, 3 to 5 year forecasts, much better in recent years. But the only time that they tend to be reasonably realistic is when you have an actual plan published by the government, as we had during the days of the IMF and ECB. But outside that, all that seems to happen is the Department of Finance says, we don't have government projections, therefore let's just make an assumption, and the assumption is always very low. So certainly for the next 3 years or 5 years, it would be desirable to be able to set out exactly what you're planning to do. You don't have to set out every expenditure measure that you want, but to look at what is the level of expenditure that is likely to take place, and how is that going to affect the economy, how is that going to affect the public finances, rather than technical assumptions that show a nice surplus developing all the time, which is just not going to happen. Now, the more medium term is certainly desirable. From a demographic point of view, very desirable indeed to be making the projections. And even from just looking at what keeping existing services is going to cost over the next number of years, that is not now being done on a very good basis. The Fiscal Advisory Council has been calculating what will be needed to keep services at least in line with what they are at the moment. And I think one of the biggest difficulties in what the Department of Finance projects is they assume there'll be no pay increases other than those already agreed, and are reluctant to put anything into forecasts that suggest there might be more pay. But those projections are not realistic at all.
Just remind members and about mobile phones. Okay, thank you very much.
So if I could just add, because your question also addressed the longer term, which is obviously very important. And I think there's two things I just wanted to add in that. One is that the Secretariat is currently undertaking some larger research to think about the impact of, as you said, particularly pensions and demographics and health spending on the longer term projections. So hopefully we will be able to report that in future sessions. But also just to make 2 points to emphasise what Michael just said. You know, even though some of these are long-term issues, they are biting also in the medium term. So even by 2023, the standstill scenario presents a much less rosy picture for the surplus, as a result largely of these pressures. And just also say, of course, in the standstill and in the forecast, the National Development Plan is built in, and that's to be encouraged and welcomed. But one point of concern that is mentioned in the report is the fact that overruns of some of those plans will squeeze out other future plans on capital expenditure, which needs to also be thought about.
Thank you.
Just make that thing again, just in terms of mobile phones, if you could please either switch them off or switch them to airplane mode. Thank you. Next, I have Deputy Eamon Ryan.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much to the Fiscal Advisory Council for what I'd have to say is a very worrying report. Long enough in the tooth here when you're saying with real clarity that we risk making the same mistakes of the past. Expenditure going up 7% a year, I have it so I'll spend it attitude, possible risk in the horizon over losing a tax base, past it was construction tax revenue, could be now corporation tax, all those warnings strike home with real clarity. Can I just ask for one kind of again just to summarise the assessment, because I mean it's funny how things turn. If I recall rightly, Chair, about a year ago when we were here, by and large it wasn't as concerning in our October meeting around our autumn, early autumn, but then you changed your stance after the budget in effect when the overrun, as you say, there were 300 million additional to what the expenditure that the government had itself projected, and what you're now saying is you're even more worried again. So that November statement was very stark, and then you found another £500 million overrun that we only really discovered when the CSO outturned data. When did that data become available? And is this the first statement since that scale of overrun became
Yes, this is our first statement since that overrun was evident, and the CSO published the data in April. So there was some evidence of it in the Exchequer figures from early January, but this was exacerbated by the CSO, which provided more detailed and more granular breakdown of government spending on a more consistent basis in April, and that was a further 500 million.
Okay. And as you say, what's particular wording is when you cite some of the areas where there's overrun, higher than estimated payments, including housing assistance. You know, there's various policy effects coming into this. A massive increase in HAP and other housing expenditures. That's one of the kind of overrun areas for that.
Yeah, so we're still waiting for some clarity on this. Like, the figures haven't been out too long, and I think that they will hopefully be reflected in updated figures from the Department of Finance as we progress through the year, particularly for 2019. But communication with the CSO has indicated that these are some of the areas where there was a difference between what the Department of Finance were showing in October, almost towards the end of the year, and then what the CSO have published for the full year. That these areas where some savings didn't materialise that were expected to, and that spending turned out to be higher than was built into the figures across a number of areas.
Okay. Can I ask you one question in relation to, in your very good report, the Fiscal Assessment Report, on page 9, in the summary at the start, at the very end, you make a point that should these adverse shocks materialise, and I suppose the real fear would be it would be a combination of a Brexit cut in demand combined with corporation tax, or indeed trade war, or Italian, you could pick the 3 or 4 big international, but if 2 of those arose at the one time, we could have a reasonably quick turnaround in an economy that's full throttle growing to one that might be demand weakening. And you say in response to that, you say that, however, the government should in principle act to support the economy insofar as possible during any period of unusually weak demand. I'm just interested to know what that could be. I mean, from my perspective, I'd be coming with the Green New Deal proposal as a major expansion of investment in the decarbonisation programme we have to do in retrofitting buildings, in building of renewables, in building out grids, in public transport infrastructure. There's a massive investment programme we have to do for a Green New Deal. Would that be one? And the New Deal was the original counter-cyclical investment programme from Roosevelt. Would that be one credible, maybe a tool that we could use if we did end it up, and who knows, please God we won't, but if we did end up in that sort of adverse circumstances, would that be a credible kind of economic strategy to use that as you say, for the government to support the economy in those circumstances?
So as an economic strategy, we would be in favour of supporting the economy if there was to be the downturn such as referred to. The actual process and the programmes through which that happens would be something that we'd be agnostic on. It would be about offering fiscal support to the economy at a time when there will be a significant downturn. The concern we would have is that if that downturn was to be significant and if sufficient space isn't created now when the economy is performing well, that we may face the trade-off we faced in 2010, 2011, 2012, where there was clearly a need to support the economy, but also there was a need to restore the financial viability of the state. And those actually worked in opposite directions. Supporting the financial viability of the state at the time made austerity and tax increases and expenditure cuts necessary, whereas the support for the economy would actually be the opposite, to actually undertake some form of investment programme, perhaps in line with the suggestion you've made there. But our view should be to avoid that trade-off, that if we are to face a situation when there is a significant downturn, that we do have resources available, and then it's up to elected representatives and government to decide how those resources can be used. What we want to avoid is facing a situation where, rather than boosting the economy and offering some support, we end up making a cyclical downturn worse, which is something we've done repeatedly over the last 40 years. So our view would be, one, to make the space available to counter the downturn, and two, if the space is available, to use it. How those are achieved is a matter for the political process.
One of the advantages of the Green New Deal, it may involve a large amount of private financing and indeed help from the European Investment Bank and others that might give us the vehicles to, if we're really fiscally constrained. But just a last question, if I can, Chair, and this goes back to, I accept your agnosticism on that sort of spending priorities, one or the other. I was very impressed that in your last meeting, with one of the previous meetings with us, you said one of the risks facing the economy is the costs of meeting our climate emissions reductions if we didn't make real emissions. You said that the scale of that on the risk side was large and the impact was also large. I suppose just to flag in terms of the National Development Plan, which was agreed last June, had no climate assessment done of it whatsoever, we've discovered since. The modelling that the Joint Oireachtas Committee got out of the system to look what would it deliver showed it would only deliver a third of the emissions reductions we need. In those circumstances, we're facing a probably fiscal cost. I know next year it's already around 200 million next year, whatever. In the medium-term outlook period, we could be looking at costs of 6, 7, 8, 900 billion plus a year. Have you done any further assessment of the risk in that, and have you included it in your mid-term projections, given that our National Development Plan is completely unfit for purpose, has to completely change, and the financial risks, if we don't do that, are very increasingly clear?
So I think our position hasn't changed. So we have looked at, this has been a significant risk, so one of our things that maybe not to promote or propose various areas where spending should prioritise, but to do with try and identify risks within the public finances. So just as on the revenue side, we identify corporation tax as being a potential source of risk. When it comes to the expenditure side, we do clearly identify climate change and renewable energy targets as being clear risks, and actually place them second. If you look at our sort of matrix of fiscal risks about halfway through the latest fiscal assessment report. So it is still there. It is something that we've identified, and it clearly does pose a risk. We haven't done any further work since we were last here, but we're not going to remove it from our risks for the medium term in the fiscal situation, and it is quite clear it is important.
I just say to conclude in the background analysis the Climate Committee has done, showing that the risk has got even larger.
Thank you, Deputy. I want to do just a very quick run-through on where we are in relation to deputies, just so as you have. I have Deputy Chambers, Deputy Lahart, Deputy Burke, Deputy Doherty, Deputy Burton, Deputy Breathnach and Deputy Cowen, all offering. So that's roughly the order in which I'm going to be calling. So so as you can see, time-wise, it's a long session. But Deputy Chambers, you're up next. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Coffey and your team. You can see you'll be here for a while yet. We've got lots of questions. But more seriously, thank you for the work that you've done. I think that the report makes for sobering reading, and I think should serve as a wake-up call in terms of trying to get back on track and managing the economy prudently. Mr. Coffey, if I can deal first with the windfall corporation tax receipts. Given that 45% of corporation tax receipts come from 10 companies, you would think that we may have been able to get under the bonnet a little bit better at this point and to try and understand why we have these huge windfall, massive tax returns coming in, and they seem to be broadly kind of unexplained. Nobody seems to know why. And I think government have at times suggested that it's because of aviation leasing or intellectual property, but I think that's questionable. And I'm wondering, Mr Coffey, have you any views on that as to, can you offer some light and try and explain why we're having these huge windfalls and why they're not being explained or not anticipated?
So I think they do remain unexplained. I think maybe we can identify some things that they're not related to. So I think that the aircraft leasing and the IP onshoring we've seen in recent years are not drivers of the increase in corporation tax we've seen in recent years. There has been some links drawn between the two of them, but the aircraft leasing sector pays some corporation tax, but not in the scale that we've seen. And the amount of additional corporation tax linked to the onshoring of IP over recent years, I think, is close to zero. There may be payments in the future, but at present they remain at zero. You mentioned that the top 10 account for a significant amount. I think what's also the case is that there's significant movement under the bonnet taking place within the figures. So the Revenue Commissioners have given us lots of good information on what's happening, and we'd always like more. But one thing that I have shown is that the top 10 is changing from year to year, that you have certain companies dropping out, making lower payments, and then being replaced by other companies making higher payments. So it's not the same top 10 every year. I think we can take it that most of those top 10 are foreign owned, but the share is quite significant. As to how we can explain the increase in corporation tax, well, one is to look at a comparison across other EU countries, and other countries have seen significant rises. So since 2011, 2012, corporation tax receipts in the likes of Germany and France have doubled. Maybe comparable to what we've seen here. So some of it could be a fallout from the end of the economic crisis, although our doubling took place in quite a shorter period of time, and receipts have now more than doubled. Those countries have shown steady increases. We had a bounce in 2015 and another bounce in 2018. I think maybe personally, moving away from the Fiscal Council, we haven't tried to explain why it's happened, but it's possible that the nature and the type of companies in Ireland is playing a significant role. That if we look at the type of FDI we attract, it tends to be large and successful companies. If companies are large and loss-making, there's limited advantage in coming to a low-tax jurisdiction. If you're likely to generate losses, you want to have a high tax rate to offset those losses against. So those companies that tend to be here tend to be large and profitable. And it may be that our corporation tax receipts are sort of hyper, excessively linked to the international business cycle, and that as has been an improvement internationally, there's probably a higher elasticity of Irish CT receipts to the global economy. But of course the potential is that if the global economy suffers a downturn and we have that excess elasticity, we could then suffer a much greater drop in our CT receipts. But as you say, the receipts are largely unexplained. It could be down to changes in rules, the OECD, the EU, just the general activities of tax collector agencies around the world, but it does remain a risk.
Yeah. Thank you. I think something for us maybe to do some further work on this committee. If I can move briefly on to the Brexit issue, and I note that you looked at the ESRI and also the central bank, and actually their forecasts or their predictions are quite. There's quite a gap between the two, if I can put it that way. And we've discussed at this committee previously that government projections are all based on the baseline, the central case scenario that there be an orderly Brexit. And I think that we can all accept that the possibility of a no-deal Brexit has increased, and nobody knows what type of Brexit we're going to get or when we'll get it. But Mr Coffey or Mr Barnes, if whoever's taking the question, just in terms of the adjustment that might be required to the public finances in the event of a hard Brexit, I'm just looking at the percentage of GNI star, the outlook here from 2019 up to 2023 for the budget balance. In 2019, we're looking at 0.3, but in a hard Brexit, on the basis of the ESRI, it's minus 1.9, and then it goes to minus 3.2 in the central bank case. And it continues in that manner right along to 2023, showing that we could be facing a significant problem in this country, and we could require a significant adjustment in the public finances. Can I ask you, how does that compare to where we were 10 years ago? If we face into a hard Brexit, what is the adjustment that might be needed? I mean, what kind of space are we in? And take, for example, the National Broadband Plan, where we have, I suppose, promises that the bulk of the spending will take place in 2022 and 2023. In the event of a hard Brexit, you know, we could be looking at the debt ratio going up to 111, so going backwards effectively. How do you think we'll cope with those major capital projects? What kind of adjustment would be needed?
Okay, so I think this is obviously an important subject, and the concerns around that hard Brexit scenario have increased since we were last here in the autumn. It's obviously very hard to know what its likelihood is, and conditional on the hard Brexit, there's also a lot of uncertainty around these estimates. But we thought it would be useful to think through, and I think your question is trying to do that, to think through what the consequences would be in different cases. What we've done is we've taken two sets of estimates, one from an ESRI-led exercise and the other one from the central bank, which give you slightly different versions of a hard Brexit. The CBI one is quite a lot worse. And actually these illustrate quite well, I think, some of the uncertainties, but some of the different scenarios that might happen, even if there was a hard Brexit. So taking the first scenario from the ESRI, which is not quite as bad, you still see a fairly reasonable deficit opening up in the next couple of years. So by 2020, you're at minus 2.3%. But if you take the central bank version, it's much worse, opens up much faster, and it reaches much bigger numbers. I should say that relative to the analysis of the SRI, for example, the fiscal impacts that we have are much larger. And that mostly reflects a methodological difference, that we take a different view of how much the slowdown in the economy would feed through into the public finances. I think it's an area where there may be legitimate disagreements, but we think this is a more realistic estimate based on our reading of the evidence. Now, the important part following from that is what the policy response could be, knowing that if you did a policy tightening, that would also have a kind of second round effect, also we can demand. And so the exercise we've done is to look at what would be required to stabilise the debt ratio over a period of time, because these shocks are big enough that some of them would mean that not only would the slowdown that we've seen in the debt-GDP ratio stop, in some cases it would actually go up again. And so trying to stabilise it over a period of a few years would have quite a big impact. And so the simulations that we showed here suggested that if you did the adjustment very quickly, you'd need a fiscal adjustment of about 4 billion euros. Or if you did it over 2 years, it would accumulate to about 5 billion. So these are big adjustments. Now, they're much less big than what Ireland experienced in the wake of the financial crisis. But they are nevertheless very large and very different to the kind of scenario that you would have in the baseline, which is why I think it's useful to raise that, but also I think underpins our policy advice that to be cautious, because the better the starting position, the less you will have to do if things go wrong.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. So, do I take it that you're saying a 4 billion adjustment in 1 year might be required? Are we looking, say, at 2020, when you can see that the baseline is 0.6 of a surplus, and in the event of a hard Brexit on the central bank analysis, we could be minus 4.7, so the variance is colossal. Yeah, it's very large. It's very large, and it's a frightening reading.
And it comes back a little bit to what we were discussing just previously. That if you have a small shock, it would be difficult, but it could be relatively manageable, and we hope, and the government could still essentially allow tax revenues to fall, spending to increase in a cyclical way, and the balance just to increase. But if you get a very big shock that was a very bad shock, the government would have to take, likely, this action to consolidate, and would have to do, as was done after 2008, would have to follow a pro-cyclical policy, which would essentially contribute to the downturn, but would be required essentially to stabilise the debt ratio again. That's why we haven't given very explicit advice about what to do in the event of a hard Brexit, because it really depends on how severe the shock turns out to be. It could be that it's sort of just a bad problem, or it could be a very serious problem. Neither of those you want to happen, but there is a big difference between the options in the two scenarios.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. My final question, Chair, is, the point you made about it's important what position you're in when this shock comes, whatever size that shock is. And given that we have quite a large level of debt and our debt ratio is quite high, and we could regress in the next number of years if Brexit goes the wrong way, what kind of position are we in if we need to borrow?
I think one way of thinking about that is that it's very hard to know the probability of a hard Brexit, and it's a very extreme outcome that we're discussing. So it's hard to know how much you should factor that into today's decisions. And I think there's no way of smoothing it out so that, you know, in every state of the world you'd end up in the same place. But what we are saying is that if you have a bigger budget balance today, that means the amount of the consolidation that you would have to do in a very bad scenario would be that much less. So it seems to us a prudent and sensible thing to be cautious, to have a slightly bigger budget balance that you'd have had otherwise, just so that if things go wrong, you're kind of that far better advanced in terms of the actions that would be required.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Chairman. Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Chairman Coffey and your, your team for your public service. So in one sense, you've been with us on a number of occasions since the Budgetary Oversight Committee was formed. And this kind of sounds like this government's soft landing moment. Because everything you've said today, you've said in the last 2 occasions that you've been here, and some of it you've actually said on 3 occasions, certainly in relation to corporation tax. I noticed the Minister of Finance has tweeted today he's taking your advice, and he says, or that he will take your advice, that this advice was dismissed in the past and there were consequences of it. Of course, this advice simply wasn't available in the past. All the big agencies in the past predicted the soft landing, with the exception of Morgan Kelly. So you've been consistent, along with the EU Commission, who've been here, the IMF have been here, the SRI has been here, the Governor has been here, and there's been 2 common themes in what you've been saying in the last 3 years. One was this over-reliance on corporation tax, and the second in the last 2 years was the government's aligning itself to a benign Brexit scenario. Now, what's interesting in terms of the Minister for Finance is going to heed what you're saying. He was in here 2 weeks ago and he got very strong advice from his Secretary General in relation to broadband, and having been pressed and pressed and pressed, even though that advice included risks to the government's reputation in terms of economic management and competence, and in terms of the government's potential reputational damage that could be done with it, pressed and pressed and pressed, he's still taking the view that he's taking. So that's the context. A couple of questions I have for you. Your language, as with everybody who comes in here around corporation tax, is so kind of soft. Could be, maybe, possibly. Why can't you tell us why it's going up, and why can't you tell us why it may go down?
It will go down. Don't know when, but it will. So CT is our most volatile of our main taxes, so it does show the greatest level of volatility. I suppose the issue is that without seeing the individual tax returns of these large companies, it really is hard to get a handle on what is driving the increases. And again, it's something we've seen kind of happen in a stepped fashion. There was a greater than 50% increase in corporation tax receipts in 2015. The increases levelled off for 16 and 17, and then we saw another large stepped increase in 2018. So it's hard to identify what happened in 2015 and what happened in 2018 and that led to those. There's a number of factors. We do have more information about the 2015 because the Revenue Commissioners have published the aggregate information from the tax returns they receive. And it does look like there was some fact of the legacy of the crash washing through, and issues in relation to companies returning to profitability and certain loss relief being exhausted. For 2015, there also does seem to be a bit of a timing issue for companies identifying this. And actually, if you look at the company accounts, a lot of the additional tax revenue was due to profits that arose in 2014, but they didn't pay it in cash terms until 2015. So that stepped increase we saw possibly should have been spread out over a number of years, and then would maybe point to a more sort of gradual increase. But I think we're not any different to any other people who are analysing corporation tax receipts. If there was a clear answer out there, I think it would be made available. To what extent is Irish CT performance exceptional? As I say, you can compare it to other EU countries which have seen large increases in their corporation tax revenues. What's different in Ireland is that our increases happened over a much shorter period and tend to be confined in over 2 years. So I think it's right that the language is somewhat couched and you have these could-bes and maybes because we simply don't know.
In relation to... Yep.
Just for one second, I just would ask you, Mr. Coffey, and your team, in relation to questions which have been are coming at the same thing a number of occasions. If you could keep the answer as tight as possible on subsequent occasions, just because there is such a list of deputies wanting to ask. Sorry, Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair. In relation to the prudence account, Chair, or any of the team, so we'll say if the prudence account was in place for 2018, what would that look like at the end of the year in terms of the final amount?
Well, I suppose you compare it to the profile for the year.
So if the prudence account was in place and there was money being set aside, I'll come back to that while you're looking for the answers. Just, Chair, as well, because of the time thing, in a note we received, an email dated 5th of June from the Department of Finance, a notable feature of this month's fiscal monitor is that corporation tax is 223 million behind target for 2019 and is also 13% lower than it was at the point in 2018. Have you any comment to make on that? Is it too early to tell whether that's forming part of a trend, or when might we know it's part of a trend, or is there an explanation as to why it's behind profile?
So the monthly receipts are something we do keep an eye on, and again, as I said, corporation taxes tend to be highly volatile, and on a monthly basis even more volatile, so it is hard to identify anything for a number of months of data. I think just in general, one thing we'd hope is that the setting of fiscal policy and the discussion of fiscal policy would move away from whether corporation tax is up or down, that we should be looking to put the fiscal policy on a sustainable and sound footing, and talk of reduction in space available for tax cuts because corporation tax is down is something we don't want to hear, just as spending overruns in certain departments being masked by corporation tax outperformance is something we don't want to hear. So I think the emphasis on corporation tax and its impact on fiscal policy is something we'd like to see things move away from, and actually discuss what is the sustainable rate of spending growth we can manage in Ireland, rather than being very much reliant on this one highly volatile tax head.
So just to directly answer your question for 2018, there's a table in table B1, which essentially says that projected in 2018, projected CT was 5.7, actual is at 10.4 billion, which means that with the prudence account, that would add 4.7 to the prudence account. 4.7 billion.
Okay.
Yeah, and that, you can see in that box, it's a very nice box, but it goes all the way back to 2015 and accumulates the difference it would make, so it's up there. Just
final question then, on page 109 of the report, where you're assessing you have a fiscal risk matrix, and health overruns actually is your top one, followed by climate change and renewable energy targets, and actually corporation tax concentration risks come after that. Can you talk to us a bit about the climate change and renewable energy targets, and why you've put that at such a high risk? Is it because of the potential fines that are payable to the EU?
Have a logical order?
Yes, so it's in relation to the size of the fines over the medium to long run. You can see that they seem to accumulate quite largely in terms of estimates that are out there. So if you take Curtin's estimates, for example, they rise to 2.7 to 5.5 billion, which is really high, and those estimates seem to be fairly plausible. Whereas if you take the corporation tax estimates, 3 to 6 billion is what we suspect might be the kind of excess that we've identified. But it's not really clear how hard those numbers are by comparison.
So what you're saying here then is that in terms of liabilities that are out there to the state, our failure to date to meet climate change targets potentially outstrips corporation tax as a risk because of the fines that are due, and outstrips corporation, what we may see the potential risks around corporation tax.
I mean, if you look at the raw numbers, that's one way to assess it. But actually, given that we have more time to address the risk around these fines, potentially, you might say that, well, that gives us more time to change course and to actually, respond. So with corporation tax, it's slightly different in that the risks could materialise, next year. It's very unclear when they will actually emerge.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Burke.
Thank you, thank you, Cahirlock, and I welcome Mr. Coffey and all the witnesses from the Fiscal Advisory Council. I think the report is very detailed and very welcome, and you provide a key actor into the budgetary process to make it more robust and to ensure that it is transparent. And just in terms of the budgetary process that we have now, and in terms of how it leads to decision making and how it leads to better detailed information to those who are making those decisions, from yourselves as key advisors to the spring-summer economic statements, the national economic dialogue for the various different sectors, the tax strategy papers, the mid-year expenditure report, and obviously the key work that this committee does in adjudicating on the work of all those agencies. Just in terms of decision making, how much do you think this has assisted in terms of making better decisions, and how can it be improved compared to the previous decade, where you had a history of budgets whereby big announcements were called off on the day, rabbits were pulled out of the hat without any notice or any stress testing?
So I think maybe the most significant impact we can have is just on discussion of some of the issues. I think back in the previous expansion, the credit-driven expansion, that many of the risks were essentially underemphasised and they were downplayed. Whereas now I think there's a much more openness to discuss these risks, not only through the existence of an entity such as ourselves, but even amongst the documents we mentioned there that are published from the Department of Finance and Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, whereas previously it would have probably been unheard of to have some of these risks outlined in such clear fashion, such as in the annual debt report, the annual tax report that the Department of Finance publish. They're now actually clearly identifying Ireland's high level of debt and Ireland's reliance on corporation tax a significant risk to the public finances. So I think maybe the presence of a fiscal council helps in that discussion, that you have somebody out there who does bring these things out into the open. And like, it's not just us that are talking about these things. We can clearly imagine that these are being discussed within the various departments, and the fact that they're willing to publish documents that reference and include these issues is a major step forward. We are not the policy makers, but we can inform the debate. We can both inform the elected representatives here and also inform the wider electorate. Because politicians have a number one aim, which is to get re-elected, and one way to do that is to give the electorate what they want. And if the electorate want poor fiscal policy, by and large that's what they'll get. But if they get a message from us and that somehow feeds through into their thoughts, and well, then maybe that will get across to you.
And just one of the key things, the Secretary General of the Department of Finance was before us in the Public Accounts Committee 2 weeks ago, and one of the assistants through your reports, your previous reports, that we could put and challenge him in a number of ways in terms of the various different concerns that were that arose. And obviously, I think it was in July 18 that you did a report in terms of designing a rainy day fund that can fit in with the fiscal rules in terms of deploying it in a counter-cyclical manner. And I know what you mentioned, the establishment of a prudence fund as well to put our additional corporations tax receipts therein. Just in terms of how that works with the fiscal rules in terms of deploying it. Could you just expand on that aspect a little bit, please?
I suppose one restriction or limit of the fiscal rules is that you mightn't get a benefit in the bad times for setting aside resources in the good times. That the fiscal rules are sort of based on a flat, well, relatively flat sort of use of fiscal resources. Yes, and actually the estimates are pro-cyclical, so the rules allow you to do more in good times and actually restrict you somewhat in the bad times. Whereas if we did have a well-functioning and well-designed rainy day fund, like one reason to have it is for use in the rainy day fund, or in the rainy day. And if the fiscal rules were to prevent that, that would limit the effectiveness of having that policy, because the reason you set money aside in good times is to use it in bad. So we just looked at sort of various ways of which that can be achieved. We think that the fiscal rules themselves are perhaps too restrictive and don't give sufficient benefit to setting aside resources in good times. There are various ways it can be taken into account. So like one suggestion would be to count it as spending when the revenue is raised and when the rainy day fund gets the money put into it in the good times, so that it makes your deficit appear worse at those times, and then it's just spent at a subsequent time, so it doesn't count against a deficit in the future, that you are actually get the capacity to spend it. But because of the way the system of accounts is designed and because of the way the fiscal rules are designed, that would be quite difficult to achieve. But it really is striking that balance between getting the benefit in the bad times or setting aside the resources in the good times. There are various ways which can be done. We've just sort of set out a couple of proposals, but it would require decisions at a higher level to be made in order for that to be operable. But I think it just shows that a mechanism like a rainy day fund can be effective.
Right. And have you looked in terms of what more, let's say, a prudence fund would require to be operable and to obviously adhere to the fiscal rules, and it could be deployed in that manner?
Well, so the prudence account is more linked to the excess corporation tax receipts, looking at outperformance relative to profile, so that any excess funds just don't remain within the budgetary arithmetic and in a sense mask some of the poor performance and bad budgetary management we've seen that they're taking out. And if there are overruns in the areas of health, that they actually are quite visible, and we do see the consequences of those decisions. Obviously, over the last number of years, it's large overruns in certain areas being masked by these corporation tax receipts. So the prudence account is probably more linked to these volatile and perhaps temporary revenue sources, and taking them out and making visible the consequences of some of the bad practices.
Obviously, it's there to be not to be deployed at that particular time. It's there to be kept like a rainy day fund. Is that your idea behind it?
Yes.
And in terms of then deploying that, would that be affected by the fiscal rules in terms of the expenditure limits?
So one of the things about the prudence account is really very much focused on the inter-year, basically, exchequer accounts, and is a way of making sure that that discussion that you have every month when the exchequer returns comes out isn't driven by the fact that, hey, there's some corporation tax that could be used somewhere else. So it's really very focused at that. It doesn't actually really have a direct implication on the rules. It would, as Seamus has said, if that money were put into the rainy day fund, because of the way the rainy day fund is currently designed, it might be hard to access that money, as with any other money in the rainy day fund. So that is an area where we think the government should give some thought in terms of the design of the rainy day fund. We welcome the principle of having a rainy day fund, but the way it operates at the moment seems to us...
Would this require primary legislation, a prudence fund?
I'm not I think it depends how it was set up. I mean, I don't know in terms of how I mean, you could set it up in different ways, I think, some of which could really...
I'm just not clear in terms of the difference between it and a rainy day fund, just in terms of how it's deployed in that. And if you're obviously talking about ring fencing receipts in a prudence fund, is that correct?
Yeah, basically, so that so every month when the exchequer returns come out, if you were in a situation where the corporation tax receipts were ahead of what had been assumed, that money would be put in some notional account where it would not be touched. And when people talked about the exchequer balance, it would be the exchequer balance once you'd paid the money, the excess, into the prudence account. So if you suddenly had an extra billion in corporation tax, it wouldn't make the exchequer balance 1 billion better, because it would have been siphoned off into this prudence account, and then at the end of the year you'd have to do something with it, like put it in the rainy day fund.
And just in terms of the view in terms of the significant increase on capital expenditure, I think over a 5-year period it's up almost at 90%, and obviously in terms of the payback that would have to the economy, obviously if we look at in the previous period where you had double-digit growth in terms of current expenditure, you had credit increase quite rapidly, whether it's credit is almost at stalemate at the moment, and you have the macro-prudential rules obviously acting as a safeguard in terms of the property market overheating. And obviously you have over 2.1 million people in a very diverse employment. Could you just give your view in terms of investing in capital expenditure and those significant increases, and in terms of when one views that compared with current expenditure increases and the risks thereof?
Well, certainly we support the strong growth in capital expenditure that has taken place over the last year or two. We were very concerned that during the downturn and the budgetary cutbacks that so much emphasis was put on reducing capital expenditure. It's the easy one to hit rather than be cutting social welfare benefits or health expenditure, etc. So we very much support the increase in capital expenditure that has taken place, as long as it's wisely spent with good cost-benefit analysis done beforehand, and hopefully with the costs identified in advance. But even with capital expenditure, there's a limit on what can be spent in an economy. If the economy is growing very fast and starting to overheat, you certainly can't just keep putting more and more capital in there. But to the extent that we can prioritise investment over current expenditure, it's certainly good for the long-run development of the economy, that you will get benefit from it over time. So we're very much in favour of that at this point in time.
Thank you. And just in terms of how then additional corporation tax receipts is channelled, when one makes the argument in terms of obviously you have your rainy day fund due to be established at the end of this year, and you have a significant increase in capital expenditure, and also you have your measure to reverse the VAT in the hospitality sector to bring in additional revenue in that regard. Those as three individual items, how significant does the Council view that in terms of responding back to the challenge of the volatility of the corporation tax receipts?
I suppose on the issue of the rainy day fund, maybe the rainy day fund that we would envisage, it would be somewhat different to the rainy day fund that's currently set out in the government's plans. That has a fixed £500 million contribution per annum that isn't really changing in response to either A, economic conditions, or B, corporation tax receipts. It's just a fixed amount. In fact, in a previous iteration, the contributions were £1 billion per annum. So they're flat and unchanging, and unlikely to have really any significant impact on fiscal policy or the economy. So I think we'd look for something that's more dynamic and more in response to economic conditions than what we've seen heretofore.
And in terms of
Just to remind you.
yeah, and just in terms of the large investment in capital infrastructure, that obviously, in your view, does that create less of a risk in terms of current expenditure to the economy, in terms of the payback potentially of improving our infrastructure, that we had such a lost decade in terms of no investment really at all in capital infrastructure?
Yeah, so as Michael has said, we have assessed the changes in capital spending, and we look at it as taking us from a position of being relatively low in EU terms as we were as we came out of the crisis, now to moving to middle and maybe moving to high in EU terms. The concern or issue would be is that we try to do everything, that we try to ramp up capital spending, try to increase current spending, and try to reduce or erode the tax base. And there are some of the problems we've faced before. So we do feel it is appropriate that capital spending has been increased, but it shouldn't be done at the same time as trying to do everything else. And one of the concerns would be that if we do face problems in the future, that if capital spending has got back to what might be considered normal levels, that just in the event of the next downturn or the next fiscal crisis, that's the area that's cut again. So we turn to the pro-cyclical issues, and capital spending being the one that you can perhaps adjust that bit quicker, exacerbates that. So rather than, as maybe Deputy Ryan suggested earlier, that you're increasing capital spending at a time maybe when the economy might need support, we have a history of doing the opposite and cutting back on capital spending just at that time when the economy could do with a level of government activity.
Thank you.
You're okay? Yeah, okay, thank you very much. We have Deputy Doherty.
I want to add to the comments of my colleagues for the excellent presentation and report that you submitted to us of a high quality and standard. Maybe just to pick up on some of the line of question there from Deputy Burke, particularly around the so-called rainy day fund, and you've outlined how the Fiscal Council would design a different rainy day fund. You have also introduced in this report the concept of a prudence fund. One of the big concerns we have, and the report talks about pro-cyclical and counter-cyclical. My concern, and I would want to tease this out with you, is with the rainy day fund is it is counter-cyclical at this point in the cycle, but it's not counter-cyclical in a downturn. And I think the work that was done by your colleague Eddie Casey outlined that very clearly in the paper. Has your analysis changed in relation to the fact that in a downturn, as we know the legislation now, it only allows for monies to be withdrawn to mitigate exceptional circumstances, which are, natural disasters, recapitalisation of banks, major structural reforms such as pension reforms. It's not there to support social welfare payments that may need to be supported because of rising unemployment or additional investment in capital. Has your analysis changed in relation to the rainy day fund, that it will not act as a counter-cyclical balance in a downturn?
That is a concern which we've expressed before, and it's still the case. So the design is still the same, and I think that's a big problem. Particularly when the slowdown was to occur, it would obviously be much better to have a rainy day fund that was designed actually to be used in those circumstances than to find yourself scrambling for a solution. And particularly with the kind of risks we've discussed with Brexit as well, some of these problems may not be hugely around the corner. Obviously, there's not much money in the fund at the moment, so it's not going to make a lot of difference in that sense. But still, it is an important concern, I think.
Okay. And in relation to the Prudence Fund, and I hear clearly what you are, the fund itself and the design of the fund, I think it's secondary to the concept of you need to just delete that from the accounts and separate it in terms of how you're looking at what resources are available. But are you concerned, because the report does say put it into the rainy day fund or otherwise? The problem is if you put it into the rainy day fund, it is locked away and cannot be used for Brexit mitigation measures under the fiscal rules, as we know. Would it not be more appropriate not to do that at this point in time, given the fact that a hard Brexit risk has intensified since your last report?
So I mean, I think the report also states, or something else.
Yes.
And that something else could be debt reduction. So to go back and just reiterate what Shane said earlier, the issue is fiscal space when something adverse happens. And if the use of the prudence account were to build greater fiscal space, it would make it less likely that this trade-off between having to take counter-cyclical actions with the budget deficit or pro-cyclical actions to try and rebuild credibility, you would change the likelihood of having to do that. So it would be an alternative option to build in exactly that space to take action when it's needed.
And just in relation to Mr. Coffey's last point, where he talks about you can't do all three at the same time, and I appreciate that in terms of eroding the tax base, increase spending and ramp up capital investment. But then there's also social needs there in terms of capital investment. Is there a need for a catch-up fund? Now, because we have to obviously have capital investment at a level which is consistent with where we need to be in the future, and we may be there at this point in time or close to it. We were very much a lagger in this for most of the last decade, but we've caught up. But is there now a need for a catch-up fund? We're probably closer to the downturn now than we are from the last downturn, but yet we have serious issues in terms of housing construction, serious issues in terms of investment. We have inadequate investment in third-level education that builds up our skills competitiveness and competitiveness of the economy. We have serious challenges in terms of the restructuring of our health service, and some of that, not all of it, but some of it has materialised as a lost decade, as a result of the lost decade. Is there a view within the Fiscal Council that there is a need for a type of catch-up fund that's not there permanently built in, but is there to catch up on what that last decade undelivered is?
I'm not sure I grasp what the catch-up fund means, but when it comes to the spending areas and the priorities that you've identified here, I think our view would be that sound fiscal policy and identifying and responding to those priorities aren't either or. They can be achieved at the same time. So, for example, we've outlined that last year government spending rose by $5 billion. This year government spending was planned to increase by something approaching $5 billion, and maybe there'll be the slippage. I could see that increase. So there are significant amounts of additional spending being undertaken. If they're not going in areas that you have identified as priorities, maybe the choice should be amongst the reallocation of that additional $5 billion in spending that's happening per annum. And if then you want to go beyond that, you don't necessarily need a catch-up fund. You just have to find additional and sustainable revenue sources that will actually fund spending increases beyond those currently penciled in. But the plans at present see spending growth of in or around $5 billion per annum for each of the last 2 years. I don't see what additional catch-up fund is needed if that's been achieved. So if there are additional priorities being identified, either reallocate funding from within that, or just identify additional revenue sources that are done so in a sustainable fashion. I think one issue that the Fiscal Council would like to get across is that those who are in favour of increased government provision of services and increased government provision of goods and capital spending across the economy should perhaps be more in favour of what we're suggesting. Because when a downturn was hitting, if it was to be quite adverse and lead to some of the trade-offs that we've mentioned here, those that will be affected, by definition, are those that are the most vulnerable.
Let me maybe clarify, and I know I'm running out of time, so I want to get on to another point, but my idea, what I want to tease out here is the catch-up fund, and particularly in relation to the Fiscal Council's view of some of the long-term sustainability or mid-term sustainability of corporation tax receipts, and us trying to move away from that situation of that $3 billion to $6 billion. Would it not be appropriate now to look at actually, well, the part that we're actually investing at this point in time should be only in projects that are deemed standalone, one-off catch-ups, as opposed to a current investment in housing. On the issue of a corporation tax as well, I just want to obviously you've highlighted the risks very clearly, but the concentration is increasing. It's now 48% of groups that make up, for 10 groups make up 48% of all corporation tax receipts. 73% is made up of the top 100 companies. There is a serious risk here. The department and the government still believe that the impact isn't high. In your view, what measures do we need to take in Budget 2020 to begin the separation of that type of concentration and reliance on the corporation tax receipts? And is it a case that the international changes that are being talked at G20 and others is a case now of not if, but when changes are going to take place that will negatively affect our corporation tax receipts in the state?
So just to conclude on the previous point about capital spending, by definition every capital project is a once-off, but capital spending is something that the government should do on a continual basis. On corporation tax, it's clear that the risks are quite significant, and we would view and assess that a high impact will be more appropriate for the concentration and concerns around corporation tax. What would be the appropriate response? Well, I think, as we've said repeatedly, the appropriate response would be to remove corporation tax from the discussion about how fiscal policy should be set and move towards a discussion of what is sustainable over the medium to long term. And that then, what happens to corporation tax then becomes something that we observe happening rather than something that becomes central to the way fiscal policy is set. But because we've seen most of these resources being used over the last number of years and have now become dependent on them, if there was to be a significant shock to corporation tax receipts, a significant deficit would open up. But if we'd set fiscal policy in a more sustainable fashion over the last number of years, we'd be in a position to absorb that shock. So I think our hope would be that we could move away from the discussion of corporation tax being a driver of fiscal policy and more towards what is sustainable in the medium term.
And the international changes?
Sorry, Deputy.
I asked the question. I just want if we could give the international changes the if or when. Is it not a case now of when, as opposed to if, that the international changes are going to negatively impact on our tax?
And that's very difficult to assess. Like, we've had these international changes for a number of years. I remember being here when the OECD first announced the BEPS project, and that was viewed as a very significant risk. But it's possible that OECD process actually has contributed to the large receipts we've seen here in Ireland. So I think there's no doubt there are risks, but I just at this early stage would be reluctant to say what direction they would go.
Thank you. Just to keep members up to date on where we are, we now have approximately 5 deputies offering. We had agreed before we started this session we would try to conclude at about 3:20. We have, if we run a little bit late, we have about 20-25 minutes left now, just for everybody to be aware of it, in terms of we have the Minister due into us at past. So next up offering is Deputy Burton.
Thank you, and nice to see you in here again. I think, first of all, just to say that spats between IFAC and the government are to be expected, as I think just par for the course. But I just want to go back to the summer economic statement of last year, because this next month, I think, or later this month, we'll see another one. And the one last year, in hindsight, had significant areas of fiction, to the point where I would rechristen it as the summer economic novel, because it's full of exciting potential, but some of it is fiction. You know, in terms of your structural work of assessing how finances are run in the country, have you given any consideration as to why that was, let's say, such a disappointment on the reality front? Was it a mistake, for instance, to abolish DPER as a separate independent department? And I know you're not policy people, but that was a mechanism for actually assessing what likely costs and so on were to be. Has that suffered since? I suppose more importantly, do we have room for tax cuts? Clearly the Taoiseach has earmarked something like around 500 million for tax cuts mainly as far as one can see at the upper end in terms of income tax. While we're expanding spending, do you think we have the room for tax cuts? Now, just to go back again briefly to last year, what happened was last year, and I have to say most of the other years after about 2013, is that the figures in November, which of course is after the budget, vastly turned out to be just vastly bigger than what had been anticipated in the budget. I mean, has the actual, if you like, identification of what the November receipts are likely to be, has that improved? Personally, and from my own professional experience, I think that's identifiable in a serious way from after July. And I just wonder, have you had any interaction with finance to find out, because you get this surge from the self-employed or the November receipts, and then the minister finds $1 billion for the health service down the back of the sofa. That's what we were all subjected to last year, basically making pretty much of a joke of the work of this committee. So are we likely to have that experience again, so that the 500 million will be back of the sofa money once again? You also refer in the statement and in the detailed statement to echoes of the previous boom, and therefore the previous boom and crash, and therefore indicate, you know, a sort of soft warning of a potential further difficult period coming ahead. Now, in respect of that, can I just ask you, what do you think is left out? You referenced the Children's Hospital and the broadband. The government's response is roughly 200 to 400 million a year, nothing to see there, not to worry about. But it is cumulative, and we don't know whether those figures will be flat in terms of each year, or whether some years there will be bumps in the expenditure. We've lost all sight of pension provision, because that seems to have been long-fingered by the government, and I'm just wondering, have you had any discussions around where have the pension figures gone to, because we're not hearing them? There's no green fund for the economy. We just declared a climate change emergency. I would think conservatively that would cost roughly $1 billion a year after, say, the first 18 months of, say, public transport, retrofitting houses, farm greening measures, and so on. But we have a climate change emergency declared by the Dáil. I think we can anticipate some element of a climate change budget. And I've always been an advocate of a minimum effective tax rate. I don't know that anybody else much in the Dáil has ever agreed with me. Do you think at this late hour, with the corporation tax structure as it is, that there is still an argument to bring in a minimum effective tax rate? I've drafted a bill to this effect some years ago, but it's never made any progress.
Could I start the response? There are a lot of questions there. We'll try and be brief. You suggest that Deeper has been changed by no longer having a separate minister, but as far as I can see, it has exactly the same role, and it's playing the same role as it was when there were two ministers there. And I know that one of the difficulties in government is the number of ministers is limited. So therefore, if you have two separate ones in finance and Deeper, there's someone else loses out, some other area loses out. But as I say, as far as I can see, it's the same Deeper as was there when there were two ministers. The room for tax cuts really depends on what other things governments want to do. The more you want tax cuts, the less expenditure you can have, and vice versa. I think in looking at what is possible in the next budget, we certainly see that there is some more room for manoeuvre beyond what is committed already by government, and a choice can be made between tax cuts or further expenditure increases without reaching what this stability programme update was suggesting would be spent in the next budget. I leave others to...
Yeah, so I'll pick up. One of the comments was about investment and NV. And I think I'll refer back slightly to the answer I gave earlier, that of course we welcome the National Development Plan. There are of course issues related to overruns and in particular the extent to which they squeeze out other projects, and we spoke earlier about how investment capital projects need to be sort of well assessed in terms of cost-benefit analysis and the benefits that you can get for further growth further down the road. Of course, if you squeeze out projects by spending a lot more on one project, you don't necessarily get as much of a boost. And I'd also raise one issue, a risk that comes with big capital investment projects, and that is that they generate a maintenance and upkeep cost, which has implications for future current spending, which also needs to be carefully thought of, even in the case of these one-off, as all these projects are. And I'll also just refer back, the pensions, certainly the longer-term work on pensions and health is something that the Secretariat are working on actively at the moment, and at a future date, hopefully we can refer to that work with a sort of bigger answer.
And then just briefly on the earlier points made about the role of IFAC and possible conflict with the Department of Finance, I suppose one thing worth mentioning is that our sponsoring department is the Department of Finance. We are an officially government-funded entity, and maybe going back to earlier points raised by Deputy Burke about the maturity and the advancement of the debate in Ireland, that we are given the opportunity by the government to criticise the government, and that shows a big change from what was there 10, 12, 15 years ago. And just in relation to the summary economic statement, I suppose we would prefer if all the information was provided in the SPU, which is published in April, but I suppose there is a recognition that there is a lot of moving parts and the figures can change, but it would be better to get the summary economic statement earlier, and if there was greater adherence to what was contained therein.
But would you not agree, sorry, just briefly, that the November, I asked about the November figures.
Yeah.
It is extraordinary that every year we have this usually pleasant surprise in November.
Okay, no, sorry, Deputy Burton, you made that, but if you have a very quick point on Deputy Burton's November figure.
I mean, it's partly an inherent feature of the tax system that revenue comes in quite late in the year. In some places, the finance uses relatively prudent assumptions, which means that often you will get this kick in. It's actually got worse because of some of the changes in payment dates and things. So this thing's actually got harder for finance to predict. One issue that we do raise in the report that we hadn't looked at very carefully in the past was also, if you look at the monthly spending profiles, they're very strange, and they assume a big fall in December, which often doesn't happen, or at least not to that extent. So I think it is important to have accurate monthly profiles. It's very odd to have this profile. I'm not sure why finance does it, but all of these good budgeting practices need to be implemented so that things are as predictable as they can be, recognising there's always some uncertainty.
Thank you very much. Deputy Breathnach.
You said you stick to 3:20, and most of the questions have been asked, but I just want to, I'm coming at it not from an economist or an accountant or a forecaster, but a school teacher was my profession, and I would always say every day is a learning day, and we're supposed to learn from the mistakes of the past and advice that we're given. I'd firstly like to thank you for your presentation. Budgeting Oversight Committee is a relatively new thing here in Ireland, and my question relates to, surely other countries have had systems in place over the years, and while I know we can't necessarily control the outcome in a small economy or control some of the issues that will happen to us, surely we learn from best practice. And I'm anxious to know, you used earlier the phrase, there's political decisions to be made. You offer advice and endorse situations or assessments and give advice to us here. My question is, there's three quick questions. One is, if you were in the political system now, based on what you know, what would you do in terms of taking the corrective action that are needed? I don't think it's...
Do you have is there a phone? We have something feeding into the mic?
No.
Okay.
Well, unless the phone is on silent. Sorry, Chair.
Sorry.
My next question relates to trying to get an understanding. You talk about GDP and the GNI star. Is there not a system that is acceptable in terms of forecasting right across Europe that is seen as a best practice? And should there be? And I want to come back on the question the Deputy Chambers asked earlier, which is, you said that there was 4.7 billion more coming in corporation tax and it was coming from 10 companies. Surely, or would you advise that somebody should be able to give us the information in relation to why these corporation tax revenues are so buoyant and good, and would that not give us a clearer picture on the data? And finally, I started by saying I'm not an accountant. Anybody who would be bored enough to have to listen to the debate that's going on here today, which is good for us as politicians, and to hear your advice, I'd ask Mr Coffey, would you give a layman's assessment to the person who has or bothers to listen into this committee here in relation to what, by 2023, based on the forecast that you're presenting here, could an average family expect in the context of Brexit and in the context of a crash out in Brexit, or indeed us not taking control of what your advice is? I'm sorry if it's a very open question, but the reality here is we need to hear the advice that you're giving. And I'll conclude and ask the question, would you give this government a green card or a red card in relation to its performance?
Okay, I'll answer two of them, leave the hard ones for everybody else. So you asked what would I do, and so I was on the radio this morning giving exactly this answer. My answer is this is, as Seamus opened with, this is just an incredibly uncertain time. So things are actually going quite well, but it's incredibly uncertain. So my answer would be I would be as prudent as I can be. And that would mean, for me at least, I would take steps that at the very least stuck to my plans. And this is exactly, I think, the point of view that's driven out in the report. So even in layman's terms, I would err on the side of caution. I would take a very careful position. And then your second question, which is this issue of GDP versus GNI star being agreed across Europe. Essentially, the rest of the European economies, and mostly across the world, use GDP as the accepted measure. It is precisely in the case of a few, mostly small, mostly open economies, where GDP ceases to be a relevant measure. I don't imagine that we will be very successful in convincing the rest of the world to move from GDP to GNI star. But what we can do is ensure that all the bodies that are looking in Ireland and assessing the Irish position, that they do use this GNI star, which we believe gives a much clearer and appropriate picture of the situation.
And just on the layman's assessment of what the average family can expect, I think it's quite difficult given the huge level of uncertainty, as Michael has outlined. But I think if I was to just talk personally and say what would I like fiscal policy to achieve for the layman or the average family by 2023, and it would be that Brexit wouldn't see a return to forced austerity, that we put in place policies that would allow us to absorb this shock through having the adequate room to do so. If we were to take the Irish economy from sort of 1999 to 2015, 2016, and just look at the endpoints, you think, what a remarkable performance. Huge increase in employment, huge increase in income, and huge increase in living standards. But that's missing out the bit in the middle, that we surged way too high in 2008, dropped to 2012, and then had a rapid recovery. If we had stable growth from 1999 to 2015, 2016, taking the endpoints as being exactly the same, it will be considered a remarkable performance. But we've had such volatility. So what I'd be looking for from fiscal policy by 2023 is to have stable and sustained increase in living standards and avoid that return to forced austerity.
And will you be listened to?
Yeah.
Thank you. Deputy Cowen.
Thanks, Chair. You said at the beginning that the electorate might get poor fiscal policy. That's not to say that they deserve it or that they want it. And Deputy Lahart might have been right when he talked about this being similar to the soft landing point in the economy's cycle. The difference now, apart from opposition benches and apart from an over-reliance on regulators, we have at our disposal EU fiscal rules, we have department ceilings, and we have yourselves, the Fiscal Advisory Council. But we still have volatile tax returns. We still have a potential volatile crash out from Brexit not being adhered to, it would appear, in the figures that are being presented by government. The government projections, you say, are that they're not credible, that they're irresponsible. And if I want to deal with capital spending, there's a lot of questions about other issues that I don't want to rehash. You rightly say, of course, that it should be done on a continued basis, it should be properly costed, and that benefits should be analysed and funding provided into the future for its delivery. But where this didn't occur might well have been recently exposed, you all know. There's the Children's Hospital and the broadband plan. And the government is faced with a predicament whereby now it must find 1.5 billion extra up to 2027 to provide for the contract that they are considering signing, and between 2019 and 2022 a further 477 million, so that's almost 2 billion. The Children's Hospital is 447 in total of an overspend, 99 which has been provided for this year, leaving 116 per annum over the next 3 years. So that's 2.35 billion. The Secretary General in the department, for example, says in order to meet that demand, the projects in the likes of the National Development Plan may well be foregone across a wide range of areas that are very pertinent and demanding of any government in relation to education and health, to name but a few. The Minister disagrees, and the government disagrees, and I don't want to be political, but I have to be factual, and says that no, that will not be the effect, that it will come from future revenues. Do you think that's credible, for that to be the case? Is it not that those funds have to come from either tax increases, have to come from new borrowings, or have to come from current expenditure? If you as rightly say that the country and the electorate don't deserve poor fiscal policy, the least they deserve is the truth, and they don't deserve fairy economics.
Okay, well, certainly money can only be spent once, and if extra money has to be spent on those particular projects, it can't be spent on others. I'm not sure what the Minister was really saying there. If there is money that hasn't been fully committed to other projects, then all the ones that have been committed to can still go ahead. But
specifically stated that no other project would be foregone as a result of this overspend, and that all the monies required to meet the demands of the overspend would be meant from future revenues. You're saying future revenues and the forecasting of the government lacks credibility and is irresponsible. I need to know, is it irresponsible and does it lack credibility to say that such funds can come from that quarter when they're not there?
If there are further other revenues beyond what has already been taken into account in the forecasts, fine, then they can be used to fund this. But I find it difficult to say anything other than the money can only be spent once.
You find it very difficult to say anything other than the obvious, which would be concurring with me, which might be seen to be political from your perspective, but from which I am acting on behalf of those to put me here to allow the electorate be informed of the reality.
I would certainly agree with the position you are putting forward.
Thank you.
If I just answer your first question, which I just wanted to point out, you mentioned the volatility of tax, and in particular the corporate tax. In many ways, what we raise in this report is the fact that this has been volatile. It is difficult to know what's going on, but the attraction and the payment of large amounts of corporate tax should be in some way seen as a good thing.
Of course.
The question that we are asking is, when you don't understand how sustainable and persistent it will be, we are recommending you take a prudent approach to how you use it. So it's not just to point out that corporate tax is a bad issue. It's a very good issue. The volatility is
the revenue the state was receiving from property-related activities in recent and many 10 years ago wasn't a bad thing. Of course, it helped and assisted in putting much of the infrastructure in place today that could take advantage of the upturn when it came.
Yeah.
So, but it was a volatile income.
That's right. That's the point to stress. It's volatile, and that
and
requires.
You know, the state was reliant on our opposition benches to point that out. Then there are much more avenues and much more authors and much more forums where that now is being said and not recognised or not taken on board. So, what have we learned from the past?
Just to pick up on a point you raised earlier as well, you mentioned three things that have changed in this new framework we have post-crisis: the EU fiscal rules, departmental ceilings, and ourselves, of course. I like to think that actually, while we seem to be working well and we're providing some impact, the other two don't seem to be working well at all.
Exactly.
As we pointed out, and I think the EU fiscal rules have been used as a crutch. Yeah, that we seem to be complying with them on the face of it, but actually they've been so pro-cyclical as to be really not helpful at all. And the Minister pointed this out in the Summary Economic Statement last year. So in the foreword to the statement, he was pretty clear that the rules are now unhelpful, totally inappropriate for the current position in the cycle, and acting in a way that's so pro-cyclical as to be not helpful at all. So I think it's important to comply with these, but it should be seen that they're a really low bar for achieving a prudent fiscal policy.
And then just to link to previous comments about better practice internationally, I think a move to a more multi-year framework would be appropriate.
Recommended that in 2015, multi-annual for health. It was promised but hasn't been delivered on.
And that is what happens in most European countries, that budgets are set over a 2-3 year period, and the short-term volatility doesn't affect the decisions.
I'm going to thank you. I'm going to move now to Deputy Boyd Barrett. I appreciate, and obviously somebody has to be at the start and somebody has to be at the end of it. We are now completely over time for this session. So while I'm not going to restrict the two deputies, I would just ask if yourselves, if you could be as brief as possible, because even with that, I reckon we're going to be a good 20 minutes over at least for our next session. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Well, thanks to the Fiscal Advisory Council. I always enjoy your contributions and reports. Don't always agree with them, but they're always informative. And I get your critique, or at least I think I get your critique, which, to use the layman's terms, I think is that given a lot of the uncertainties and vulnerabilities in the economy and outside it, Brexit, possible downturns, onset of protectionism, over-dependence on corporation receipts and so on, that we could be in a very vulnerable position. And in that situation, having spending estimates which may be less than realistic, given the commitments the government have made, could cause us a big problem if any of those chickens come home to roost, I think is more or less your critique. But then, of course, it still leaves the political conundrum for all of us as to what do you do with that. And I mean, it seems to me that in broad terms, you've got three choices. One is you spend less, two is you raise more money, or three is you manage your projects better. And probably the answer would include all three. But trying to figure out, what are the key ways of dealing with that problem is a trickier question. And I would put it to you, number one, given the size and openness of our economy and its vulnerability to all of the things that you said, there's almost nothing we could do against the unpredictable. I'd just like to put that as a general thing. I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything, by the way, but I'm saying if any of those chickens come home to roost, we're probably not going to really be in control of the situation. So I'd just be interested to hear your response.
No, so I think that's a bit defeatist. I think that there definitely is something we can do, because we do identify a lot of risks, a lot of problems that could emerge. But one thing our analysis shows is that, in general, the response to almost all of them is the same. So whether that's a problem of domestic overheating and the economy running to an unsustainable level of output, or the potential for some of these external risks to bite over the next 12 or 18 months, the response to the wide range of risks we present is not to have a full utilisation of the fiscal resources that are available now. Actually, the economy doesn't need a fiscal stimulus. If there are spending priorities, that space should be made to make room for those through increased tax revenues. And if these downturns are to hit in the future, to avoid facing the trade-off between supporting the economy and rebuilding financial creditworthiness, that if we had a better starting point, we'd be able to better absorb those shocks. So while there are significant risks out there, and yes, we are a small cork bobbing in a very big ocean, we can put ourselves in a much better position to deal with these problems when they emerge.
Well, look, I mean, I still think we are such a small cork, and that's part of the problem. And I would say, in general, the more things the government control, the slightly more control we have over the situation. But to my mind, private interests have too many control over what will happen in that situation, and therefore they just do it to us, as they did in the past. But anyway, that's an ideological point. But maybe to take one that I think maybe you should focus a little bit more on, and you do reference it, is the drift in an increase in cost of housing assistance. Okay, now to me, this is one that we should be talking a lot more about, right? Because we shouldn't be so vulnerable to that. And are you concerned, because you are flagging, I know you can't be too political, but you are flagging certain concerns. Are you concerned about our exposure to what private property sector interests could potentially do to us, given the dependence of rebuilding Ireland on those private property sectors? I mean, to me, if it was me, if I was Minister for Finance, I would grab as much of that extra corporation tax revenue as I could and more, and I would barrel it into a massive council housing programme, because at least it would mean that that particular exposure would be significantly reduced, as well as dealing with what is a major macroeconomic problem and a social problem at the moment, right? But would you mightn't agree with all of my sort of prognosis, but would you agree we have a massive exposure in that area that could be every bit as big potentially as some of the other ones we're talking about in terms of threat or vulnerability?
So what spending priorities you wish to target are entirely a decision that is open, and one we don't have a view on. The risk posed by the housing payments is one that can be identified, and I suppose one issue is not just in relation to the private sector. Almost all the rental supports that the state offers are linked to market rents. That's right. And these include the payments to the approved housing bodies, where the supports given to them are based on roughly 90% of the market rent. And so one reason why those costs can be increasing is because of the volatility and currently the upward direction of these rents. But these aren't necessarily just to the private sector. We do have significant housing provided by the approved housing bodies, and the payments to them are linked to market
But the rents in the AHBs are controlled. They're largely controlled, whereas they're not in the private sector.
The rents paid by the tenants, so the differential rent paid by the tenants is obviously controlled, but the rents paid to the AHBs themselves as part of the contract would be based on the market rent, and the market rents are in some areas controlled. But it does present a risk. It seems likely that last year there was an underestimation of the amounts that were set to be paid. How you would go about ameliorating that risk, I think, is open to debate. Maybe a greater, different approach to housing. We've discussed it before here in relation to based on the cost rather than based on market prices. But that's something that takes a long time to develop. Other countries have done it over a period of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Here we've had a process of building council and corporation houses and selling them, which has undermined our ability to do that.
One more question?
You have about 30 seconds.
Yeah. Can you go into any more detail what you consider to be sustainable sources of extra revenue? I mean, you know what our view is about where you could and should get extra revenue from wealth taxes, corporation, effective taxes at least on corporations, or employers, PRSI could be increased to European levels. But are you willing to go as far as to say what are a few examples of sustainable additional revenues as against not sustainable?
All of those could be considered sustainable source of revenue. Like, it's up to estimates to be made about the revenue that could be generated, and can it be generated on a repeated basis. And if it can be done so, in our view, will be considered sustainable.
Broughan.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach, and apologies, I had to slip out to the questions there with the Taoiseach. So just to thank IFAC, as always, for a very interesting presentation report. Can I just ask you, just following on the last point about broadening the tax base, would you see carbon taxes of one kind or another sort of coming to the rescue, in the sense that you know, the Dáil has adopted our committee's report for climate emergency and so on. We urged the Minister, I think some of us, to start equalising diesel and petrol excise duties last year, for example, which certainly would have brought in more revenue. But will there be a sense that some of the taxation that will inevitably result if we are trying to meet our carbon targets and to decarbonise the economy will fulfil some of the broadening? And have you taken any point of view on the way we've been thinking in terms of how to protect our more vulnerable communities in relation to carbon tax? Because we heard the Green Party leader talking about the Green New Deal and so on and so forth, but a lot of us would be very concerned about vulnerable households in fuel poverty and so on. So, like, would you agree, for example, with a tax and dividend approach, where the dividend would go back to each household or each citizen? So that's just the first point, in other words, around carbon taxation. Just secondly, around why do you still include the debt ratio among your four major approaches to the future or whatever? Given that the coupons is at page 96 there, page 98, where you say the coupon bonds have largely been refinanced and so on. After 2021, maybe there's some bonds there that we might have difficulties with, but do we need to be worrying so much still around the debt ratios? And just finally, today you might have noticed that a very important drug for a very small section of patients, Spinraza, finally received approval, and it follows on, I think, a similar one. Most of the deputies in the room here, we campaigned for this, for Spinraza to become available. We heard an indicative cost there today of 20 million per annum. There was a previous one, Cowen, I think, where again we campaigned for it, and it has been approved. But do you see any, the health budget year after year, you have these the overruns. So even if you had a 3-year ceiling, and we have a new chief executive, obviously, in the HSE, formerly of Deeper, and who seems to want to be relentlessly and ruthlessly control expenditures. But do you see any way in which we can have a realistic approach to health spending, which might involve maybe an extra 2 or 3 billion a year, and to go and get the revenue necessary for that? Thanks, Cathaoirleach.
You want to go?
I'm afraid on your first questions, I just go back to what Seamus read out at the start, that the Council's mandate does not cover commenting on the choice of individual tax measures or spending. So getting into what particular tax broadening measures you should have, or what carbon tax or carbon dividends, is not within our remit, and we should not really comment on it.
But will there not be an inevitable broadening of the tax base as a result of our attempts to meet 2030, 2050 targets?
Yeah, but if you're asking us what sort of carbon tax, how high level, what sort of dividends,
I'm not asking you that. I'm just saying that part of the mix of your box of surprises or whatever, it's not a surprise. We're going to have to address this seriously. Most of the House, I think, agrees with that. But surely it will. One impact of it will broaden revenues, but it may have a bad, difficult impact on some of our more vulnerable communities.
Yes, and those are matters for political decisions on how you do it. But as I say, we are not going to comment on what sort of carbon tax it should have and how it should be mitigated. On the debt ratios, even though debt interest rates are very low, we still have a very high level of debt as a proportion of our GNI star. We're about the 5th largest in the world. So even with low interest rates, we still have a big problem. And low interest rates, we don't know how long they will last, but in the capital markets, if they see us getting back into difficulties and needing to borrow more and more and more, we can have big problems. And the best way to mitigate that is to get our debt ratio down as quickly as possible and be less dependent on the financial markets.
And just on the last question, so obviously the new drugs, particularly some of the new drugs, are extremely expensive, and that's one of the drivers in Ireland, but in many other countries, of higher healthcare costs. I think what it underlines is the importance of having good medium-term forecasts and projections for what health spending will be, and it should be based on a realistic assessment of what's driving health spending, and that's partly, population ageing, but it's also things like these new drugs. And I think one of the problems at the moment is they're not really it doesn't seem to be a realistic baseline, and then people don't really stick to it. But I think having a more medium-term approach would be very helpful. For example, in the UK, they've just started for the first time, they have a long-term 5-year plan, which envisages quite rapid rises in health spending. But actually those increases are more or less in line with the historical experience of recent years. And so in principle they should provide the headroom to deal, for example, with these new drugs, as well as the population ageing, increasingly complex mix of pathologies and things like that. So I think that shows that it would be very helpful. The planning was done on that basis, so everyone knew where they were starting from.
And just one brief final point. I mean, and you say some things are political and some things are obviously for yourselves and for economic theory and so on. But I mean, is there any realistic possibility there will be a prudence account? I mean, we had this huge debate about the. Well, I'm just saying the prudence account. What's the chances of having a prudence account?
We hand that over to you, politicians. We have suggested it.
Thank
it's
you.
up to you to decide.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to draw this session to a close. I think one of the things I've learned out of today is that a thesaurus is a very handy tool as well for economists. When you want something different to rainy day, you end up with prudence. You can keep on looking to see which word comes next. Listen, we'd like to thank you very much for coming into us today. We very much appreciate the time and the exchange we get as a committee with you. It forms a really important part of our schedule. Apologies for having to bring it to a conclusion, but we are well over time and we have another session to go to. But my thanks again to you, and we will now suspend and go into private session. Thank you. That we go back into public session. Thank you very much. We are now in public session. Just the reminder, as always, to members on mobile phones. I would like to welcome Paschal Donoghue, Minister for Finance and Public Expenditure and Reform, and he's accompanied today by John Hogan, Assistant Secretary, Department of Finance, by Keith Walsh, Principal Officer and Chief Economist, Revenue Commissioners, and by Anne-Marie Walsh, Principal Officer, Department of Finance. And John McCarthy, sorry, as well. Apologies. I have also... So today we are meeting with the Minister on the review of local property tax and the report of the international group. Before we get into our actual opening statement from the Minister, I'd just like to go through the privilege notice, just to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to their evidence to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect to your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So, having concluded that, I would obviously like to thank you again for attending here today, Minister, and now ask you to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, for your invitation to engage with the committee on the topic of the local property tax, which was the subject of a recent review. I referred the review report to the committee for its consideration in light of the report's findings in relation to the impact of residential price movements on LPT liabilities under a number of scenarios. As you know, I deferred the next valuation date from the 1st of November 2019 to the 1st of Order 2020 by order under the Finance Act of 2012, with a view to providing time and space within which to engage with the committee and hear its views on the appropriate way forward for the LPT. In 2015, Dr Dawn Thornhill conducted a review of the LPT, which made recommendations in relation to, in particular, any impacts on LPT liabilities due to property price developments. On foot of Dr Thornhill's 2015 report, Minister Noonan proposed to Government that the revaluation date for the LPT be postponed from 1 November 16 to 1 November 19. This postponement meant that homeowners continue to have their homes valued for LPT purposes on the basis of their 1st of May 2013 declared valuation, and so were not faced with significant increases in their LPT in 17 and 18 as a result of increased values. LPT liabilities for 2019 are based on the 2013 declared valuation. Absent any change in the LPT legislation, the valuation of properties on the 1st of November 2019 would have been the basis for calculating LPT liabilities in 2020 and beyond. In that regard, the LPT review indicates that the impact of such a no-policy change would mean, for example, that 27% of residential property owners would see an increase of between €101 and €200, 28% would experience increases between €200 and €300, and 30% would see higher increases. I initiated a further review in 18 as I considered it was important that the Government was able to make its position clear in relation to LPT so that households will be aware of plans for the tax well in advance of the November 19 revaluation date and the associated 2020 and beyond LPT liabilities. I further considered that it was essential that the principle that formed the central part of the terms of reference for the 2015 review of LPT, i.e. achieving relative stability in LPT payments of liable persons, both over the short and longer terms, would inform deliberations on the matter. By relative stability in LPT liabilities, I mean that any increases should be modest and affordable and, of course, fair. The review examined the impact of house price movements under a series of scenarios involving different rate and tax band structures. However, against a background of significant but geographically very uneven increases in residential property price levels. I believe it's necessary to engage in further consultation to identify a scenario that would deliver on the condition I set, that there should be relative stability for all taxpayers in their LPT liabilities, and that any increases should be modest and affordable. The review group found that the key challenge in their analysis is the significant variation of property price increases geographically, which introduce significant complexity to the task of attaining moderate and affordable adjustments to the tax in an even manner across the country. I'm also conscious of the importance in maintaining simplicity in the operation of the LPT, which was a major success factor in its introduction. Details of the scenario analyses are set out in the report. For the purposes of the review group targeted a broad yield of €500 million, a modest increase on the 2018 yield of €482 million in recent years, and on this basis the group considered 5 different approaches to the calculation of LPT liabilities. 1. A central rate. 2. Targeting individual local authority yields equal to the 18 yield without the local adjustment factor. 3. Differing rates for each valuation band. And 4. Increasing the valuation band thresholds. I note the review group finding that all scenarios involve winners, that is, taxpayers who would see their LPT liability reduced, and losers whose liabilities would increase. Moreover, the increases and decreases would be different in each scenario. The review considered other relevant issues, including 100% retention of LPT yields by local authorities, continued flexibility on the LAF, and the need to ensure that adequate funding is available for local authorities. The introduction of LPT addressed 3 challenges. 1. Broadening the tax base. 2. The provision of a stable funding base. And 3. The strengthening of democracy at local level. International experience has shown that property taxes are a secure, stable source of funding compared with transaction-based taxes. As a measure which is a tax on assets, not employment, the LPT should not adversely affect growth and job creation. I consider that LPT has the potential to play a more significant part in our overall taxation system, and it's important, therefore, that the future of the tax is secured, so as to maintain the possibility of enhancing and enlarging on its contribution as a proportion of overall tax revenues, and maybe, over time, looking at the possibility of it approaching a European norm. At just 0.6% of national income, the LPT yield is low when compared to rates of 2.8% in France and over 3% in the UK. The review included a public consultation process. It indicated that the committee was against proceeding with automatic revaluations in 19, as provided for in current legislation, as this would result in significant increases. I note that the committee supports revaluation with an adjustment to rates nationally to maintain LPT yield, or revaluation with an adjustment to rates locally to maintain LPT yield. The committee also recommended cessation of exemptions in relation to new and unused properties on equity grounds, and because it broadens the tax base. The deferral of revaluation until November 20 provides time and space for the committee to consider the report of the interdepartmental review and to provide its views to me. I hope our session today will facilitate that exchange of views. In my engagement with the committee, I am seeking to promote the policy objectives that I consider should underpin any change to the tax. Protect the overall yield, modest and affordable increases if they occur in LPT liabilities, integration of new properties into the LPT base, maintenance of the tax base with a small number of exemptions, and upholding the progressivity of the tax. I've stated publicly my view that reform of LPT needs to be based on a model of band widening combined with rate changes. But it is, however, very challenging to come up with a model where no one faces an increase in their LPT liability. I support retention of the option for local authorities to reduce the LPT rate for their area, and I've indicated my willingness to engage with the committee on the issue of taxpayers whose property is located in a managed estate on which the owner of the property is liable to the payment of management fees. In order to bring this matter forward, we will need, I believe, legislation to be enacted by next March. Amendments to the LPT legislation are separate to the finance bill process, as they involve local rather than national taxation. Therefore, it will be necessary for me, I believe, to be in a position to see a scheme presented for a bill in January of next year. I know there are diverse views amongst members in relation to the LPT, including the view that it should be abolished. Nevertheless, I hope we can have a constructive engagement and work towards achieving a consensus as to the future direction of LPT, as I firmly believe there is a latent potential for the tax to play a positive role in our overall taxation system. In view of the timeline I've outlined, I would appreciate, if possible, having the considered views of the committee before the end of this current session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. We will now open to the deputies, and the first deputy who has indicated to me is Deputy McGrath.
Thank you very much, Chair. Minister, you're very welcome, and your officials, and thank you for your opening statement in advance. Can I just ask you to clarify, Minister, what you are asking the committee to do, because as you've indicated in your opening remarks, there are diverse views, and you only have to look around the room to realise there isn't going to be a consensus at this committee. You may well get a majority view, possibly, perhaps not, but what are you expecting of the committee? Because what the committee had said in its report, which was published in March of 2018, and you've cited that report in your opening remarks. We had expected that you would come back to this committee prior to the budget last October. That wasn't possible, presumably because the report wasn't ready. So what are you expecting of the committee? And you're saying now by mid-July.
My key point in my consideration of this is when I looked at the different options that I would have considered, that independently the committee reached the same view on, which is that we either maintain a national rate or that we allow local authorities to deliver the same yield by county, but that they have the ability to vary the rate. That in so doing, it became obvious to me that while it was possible and is possible to maintain the total yield of the LPT and for that to be unchanged, it is very challenging to be in a position that individual tax owners, that every single one of them will be in a position where their bill is unchanged. So, because of the exceptional geographical diversity that is in it, an unchanged national yield of the LPT is not the same as an unchanged liability for everyone who is currently paying the LPT. And that is because of the differing rates of property increase across the entire country. So I have furnished to the committee the detail now of the different options that you considered, that I independently of you considered as well. And if the committee is in a view to form a view on either of any of the scenarios that I put forward, and there are 5 in total, they would be helpful for me in then what I will need to do later on in the year. Because I'm conscious of within this committee, I need to assemble a majority to support changes that we will have to enact early next year.
And just on your timeline, Minister, you referred to early next year, so early 2020 if we're all still here at that stage. There are certain exemptions that are due to expire in October, and I think you have said in parliamentary replies that those will be extended on an administrative basis. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Pending the legislation?
Yes. So my objective, Deputy, would be to maintain it on a no policy change basis until we get to the point at which legislation will be needed to renew this tax in its entirety.
Okay, so for those properties, and I think it's in the region of 60,000 or so, are in the main category of newly acquired properties over the last number of years. So their first liability will be 2020, 2021? When will their liability be?
2021.
Will be their first liability. Yeah. Can I ask you to just clarify something for me in relation to scenario 2, which is where the LPT yield for each local authority is to be kept more or less the same, and then an analysis is done on the home valuations in the area. So the rate for that local authority can be adjusted based on those revised valuations to ensure that the yield for that local authority remains pretty much consistent with what it was. But according to the interdepartmental report, some 80% of properties in that scenario will see an increase of between from above zero to 200 to over €200. I'm just struggling to understand how that is the case, given that in each local authority area there will be new properties that are coming into the mix where the exemption will have fallen, so that will mean extra revenue. The local authority is having a target of collecting the same amount as it did under the old regime. So how can it be that some 80% of properties in that local authority area will be facing an increase? Is it to do with the treatment of the local adjustment factor here? Is that what it is?
No, it's not. I mean, Deputy, to deal with the first part of your question, even if and as we bring in existing homes into the LPT threshold and net, which we will need to do, the overall revenue that they will be contributing will, in the early part of their introduction, be a relatively small part of the new LPT yield. In relation to why there is such a variation, and you've identified here even in scenario 2, it's for 2 reasons. The first one is there has been such geographical variation by county. So we have seen very, very different rates of price changes by county across the country. And then even within counties, we have seen very uneven rates of price increases. And this is the key point. Because the degree of price inflation by county and then within counties has been very, very uneven, it is very, very difficult to come up with a model in which you can ensure that there is nobody who does not face a change. And my view has been, in the debate that has been ongoing now in LPT on the back of this Oireachtas committee report, and indeed in my own comments on the matter, that point was perhaps needed to be made clearer before we go down a path of bringing legislation into the House on it.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, but that's really a restatement of what you said earlier on. I'm just struggling to understand how, under that scenario, where a specific council is going to bring in the same overall amount as they did under the old regime before the revaluation, they will now have additional properties that are in the net, and yet the overall yield will be the same. How is it that 80% will actually be paying more?
Because of the price variation within the county.
But that doesn't explain it.
Well,
sure.
if it will be of help, I'm happy to supply the model behind this to explain this to the committee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That much they compensate for what the other 80%.
Yeah, it's because of how uneven the price development is. That's it. And I mean, we have based all these calculations off the figures that we have from what we have collected from the Revenue Commissioner, and this is the yield that it delivers.
Mr. Hogan was able to establish anything further there. I'm just.
Sorry, excuse me.
Well,
Deputy McGrath.
What I can do is, as this discussion develops, is I can ask my officials to come in and comment on it as well. But this is what the model that we have of property prices across the country has yielded.
Okay, so you revert to the committee
yes,
with an explanation on that point. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. I just would like to note, just in relation to your officials and the committee, we did unfortunately have a situation where we were hoping to have that briefing, and we as a committee weren't able to progress with it. So we do acknowledge that, and we look forward to a chance to re-engage on that. Thank you, Deputy McGrath. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Well, Minister, as you know, people before profit, among others, have always opposed the property tax, and we would ask you, given the review that has been underway and the fact that at some point you're going to have to make decisions on all this, to consider again abolishing the property tax for the following reasons. At the time that you brought it in, you said it was going to achieve a number of things. You said it was going to provide more funding for local services. It hasn't done so. You said that, or your government, I should say, said that it would help dampen the sort of property madness that we saw prior to 2008. It clearly has not done that. And it hasn't turned out to be fair in the way you suggested it might be. And I put it to you that the fact that it's been deferred several times and that even now you don't quite know what to do with it, and we're left in a situation where we have to look at all sorts of convolutions to reconfigure it, is proof that it was fundamentally flawed from the beginning and that it was always going to be unfair because it was linked to property prices, something over which a householder has absolutely no control whatsoever, and which have, in the intervening period, gone out of control. That it is something that people have paid for already, and where the ability to pay, the income coming into the household, is not taken into account at all. And all the chickens, if you like, have come home to roost on the property tax, and we're left in, and you're left in the dilemma of what to do. And isn't it really, without trying to over-politicise that, isn't it fair of those of us who opposed it right from the beginning to say, actually, this dilemma we're in is a good reason to reconsider the whole merit of the property tax? It's a fundamentally flawed tax. And mightn't it, given that a lot of the problems that you're now facing with the property tax being linked to property values going through the roof, and all difficulties that now poses in terms of this, the likely huge increases if you went ahead with the original the property tax as is originally envisaged, but even with you trying to change it, the problem of property values being at the heart of the difficulty in doing that, wouldn't that lead you to think that actually the problem is the property market, and that you might reconsider some of the things that we've said all along, is that rather than put an unfair tax on the family home, that we would reconsider things like wealth taxes, particularly on the enormous wealth that has been generated by people who are speculating in property. And a reconfigured property tax might be redirected away from ordinary homeowners towards people who have been profiteering from the property sector, and driving that sector, into a situation where it's out of control and is doing immense damage at all sorts of levels to society, to people who are trying to put an affordable roof over their head, and indeed, I would say, at this point, is a macroeconomic threat, really, the mess in the property market.
Thank you, Deputy. So I take a different view in relation to Deputy. I do believe that a tax code should have the ability to appropriately tax assets, and I believe the local property tax has got the balance right between trying to have a broad definition of what wealth is and being able to tax it in a progressive way. And the more valuable your home, the higher the payment you make. And I would have hoped that principle of progressivity is something that you would support. We are one of the few countries in the world that prior to the introduction of the LPT did not have a property-related form of tax. But what I also know from looking at what has happened in property taxes elsewhere is the first point of revaluation is the most challenging, because it normally comes after a period of property price growth and change, and that is what we are now facing into. In relation to the point that you make regarding how do we tax people who might be profiting from forms of commercial development, this is why, for example, we made the decision to increase stamp duty on commercial property for that very measure and for that very reason. And measures like that go some way to ensuring those that might profit, in particular from commercial development, make a bigger contribution to the delivery of public services.
One supplementary?
You've about 10 seconds.
Well, you yourself, in your opening contribution, have said that some of the problems you're now facing in reworking this are to do with the unevenness of property prices, property price increases, and so on, right? Can you seriously say that with one breath and then say it's fair to levy a tax based on the value of someone's property when you've just stated that the values of those properties are uneven? There's no consistency. There's no fairness to how those property prices have gone up, down, or whatever. Well, they've all gone up. How can you say those two things when clearly the value of that property bears no relationship to the actions of the householder?
I don't believe that it introduces a tension, but I do believe it does introduce a difficulty in relation to how to do it. But I believe it's one that we have to overcome. Because ensuring that we have that the first revaluation of the LPT is one that is successful, it offers the opportunity of this tax making more of a contribution into the future to the delivery of public services. And if that happens, it means local authorities are able to fund themselves better, they have more resources, and it avoids the kind of pressure that we might face then on other forms of tax collection. I don't see it as a tension. I do see it, however, as a difficulty that I'm recognising in the decision that I made for deferral.
Thank you very much, Minister. Deputy Breathnach.
Chair. Firstly, thank you for the engagement, Minister, with you and your officials. I have to say, having come from local government, when nobody particularly likes additional taxes, I would have to say that the public generally, in my view, were accepting of it on the basis that it would be spent locally. And the first comment I would like to make to you is I think it's terribly important that you mentioned the word when you spoke earlier about democracy at local level, but accountability at local level to me is more important in terms of people seeing where that property tax is being spent. And as a local public representative before I came in here, there was absolutely no doubt that people wanted to see a transparency in where this money is being spent. A lot of people would expect it to be spent outside the front door. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about seeing the money that's collected and that we get value for money at local authority. I think that's one of the major engagements that needs to be done, and an accountability by the local authorities exactly where and what the property tax is being spent on. That said, I just want to hone in on something we raised when we were debating, which was the issue of the exemptions and deferrals. I just ask you to comment, Minister, on why it is not possible that when a property gets planning permission and obviously a commencement notice or a completion notice, that the automatic collection would provide that equity in terms that when somebody builds the property that they start to pay the property tax. And we have figures here of the number of houses and income that could have been generated from 2013 to now had that system been in place. And will you be contemplating putting that type of a system in place for future bills so that everybody, there's an equity if you have a property and you're living in it, that you pay for it? Equally, I'd ask you to comment on whether there is an opportunity here to, particularly in view of the fact, and I've harped on this very much as I came into this Oireachtas, that I argue that 1 in 8 houses right across the country are vacant, and would you consider looking at a situation where a property is left vacant for a period of time to be agreed? Obviously, it would have to be over probably 12 months that we should, in order to encourage these vacant properties to come back into the market, that an additional LPT would be applied when people are sitting on vacant properties, and therefore it would be an encouragement to actually bring them back into use in the form of a carrot and stick. And lastly, I'd just like you to comment, or your official to comment on the whole issue of deferred payments. I have a difficulty getting to grips that people are putting a lot of this on the long finger. And is there a mechanism where somebody finds that they can afford to clear, that there's an incentive if they have deferred the payment of the property tax and find that they need to, for a windfall that they have got or whatever, that they can actually be incentivised to clear that without having to incur massive penalties as a result of having deferred it in the first instance.
Deputy, I got your question in, occupation, sorry.
Yep.
So in relation to your 3 questions, to deal with the first one, the reason why it wasn't proper, the reason why it's not possible to extend the LPT now for new homes that are being built in the absence of a revaluation for all would be that then we would have to tax properties that have just been built on the basis of the 2013 valuation. Because, in other words, then we could have been in a situation where we're taxing one property on 2013 that existed in 2013. If a new property is going to be built, we would have to find a way of inferring a taxable value on that that is also consistent with 2013 market pricing. And the challenges of doing that and being able to do it fairly are just immense. So while I accept and want to change and will change the fact that you have some properties that are not paying the tax at all, we were not able to come up with a system that would allow us to infer onto a property that has just been built or built since 2013 what its value would have been in 2013. In relation to your point there about the occupation of the property, and would I consider changing the LPT so that its weight changes if the property is unoccupied or not? Occupied or not, I'd be cautious about doing that, Deputy. And the reason for that is the experience that I had in front of this committee where I produced a report in relation to unoccupied properties and whether we would bring in a form of tax there to encourage greater occupation. And the 2 learnings that came out of that report is, number 1, the number of properties that are unoccupied is a lot lower than people might expect. And number 2, those unoccupied properties can be unoccupied for a variety of different reasons. And for example, if you have a property that is unoccupied for reasons of care or ill health, I think we need to take care about whether we tax that or not that you are suggesting that. And then finally, in relation to deferral, is there an option on people to pay earlier if they, in other words, if they have the opportunity to pay now and reduce what they're going to pay at a later point? That incentive is there at the moment because obviously the more they clear off the amount that is due, the less they will pay of a final amount in the future because they will be reducing their interest payments in the future as well.
Thank you. Okay, and next we have Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Minister and your officials. I think I've heard you use the word, Minister, we, more often than usual in your responses here. It's usually I, which seems to indicate...
I meant this we over here, Deputy, just for the purposes of clarification.
Well, that's reassuring.
I wasn't extending any further. No, perhaps this illustrates the difficulty, though.
That's reassuring because your last couple of paragraphs, it's you know, there's a lot of what we need to do. So we're the Budgetary Oversight Committee, we're not the Budgetary Formulation Committee, that's your job. I do notice though, I suppose from a budgetary oversight perspective, when it does come to difficult decisions, you know, whether it's the carbon tax or petrol and diesel equalisation and the LPT, you've failed to make any decision really on any of them. Just from a general perspective though, you seem to have nailed your colours to the mast. This is why I'm wondering about the we aspect of it in the later part of your contribution. So you've nailed your colours to the mast. You want to see LPT, you say it has the potential to play a more significant part in our overall tax system. So you've indicated, you know, a policy stance on that. So a more significant part is, I presume, you want the yield to be bigger. And I suppose to develop that stance further, you've gestured then to France, where the property taxes represents 2.8% of GDP, and it represents over 3% of GDP in the UK, whereas in Ireland it's at 0.6%. I mean, why put that in unless you're gesturing to your own position on where you would like to see this go? That would be a very significant, represent very significant increases on property owners. Yeah, if you want to take.
Well, so first, in relation to my 2 points, your 2 points about me making or not making decisions. For the decisions that I've not made in relation to taxation that you've pointed to, I'd also point to the ones that I have made. Principally what we did in VAT in the hospitality and services sector. I'd also point to the change that we made in the betting levy. I'd also point to the changes that we made in stamp duty on commercial property. So yes, you are correct to say there are some changes that I haven't made. There are also other changes that I have made that each at that point in time faced resistance from some in the House and certainly from those who were affected by them and still do. And experience has taught me that if we're going to make further changes, particularly in the area of carbon taxation or this, we need to build up a degree of consensus for doing it, like I've done in the other changes that I have made, and I have done them. In relation to the point that you make in relation to the very, very long-term view of it, I would like to see LPT deliver more of a yield than it does at the moment. But the caveat that goes against this, which is a caveat that has influenced what I have not done in relation to LPT revaluation, is that any changes have to be modest and affordable. And I'd like to try to get to a position that the change that I propose to the committee, because you are right, it is my responsibility to propose, is one that sees, for many, it doesn't see a change. For some, if they do see a change, it's a change by a single band. And then for others who do see a change, it's one that's related to the value of their property. I think where we will see the larger increase in yield equity will be by the number of new homes that come into the LPT net. I think that is the way in which we will, over time, see this yield grow. But I think we have a long time to go to see enough new homes being available in our economy to get to the percentage of tax yield that I referred to a moment ago.
So you would see us then heading in the direction of the GDP rate they would have in France or the UK?
I don't see that happening in the short or medium term.
Okay, because that would be 5 or 6 times the rate.
Yep, and that's what I have said, my key characteristic in all of this, which is why I've made the decision that I did, that anybody who faces an increase, if they do face one, it should be modest and affordable.
But that doesn't tally then, Minister, with what you're saying about that you would like to see the tax play a more significant role. You don't say a more modestly significant role, even though that's an oxymoron, but a more significant role, and you talk about enlarging its contribution as a proportion of the overall tax yield. And
I've explained that the way I see that coming about is by new homes as they are being built, being brought into the LPT base.
So those new homes, Minister, thanks for that. Like they're, you have neighbours. I made this point the last time we spoke about this. So you have people who have been, in some cases, exempt for 5, possibly 6 years, living side by side with people who've been paying their property tax and paying for their local services. Was there not even an opportunity to address that at this stage? And just if your officials have a costing on, even an average costing on what the exemption of 60 to 70,000 houses has cost the Exchequer annually under existing rates?
So we did look at the opportunities to do it, but we did not find a way of doing it that would be fair to all. And it goes back to the point that I made to Deputy Breathnach. In order to have a taxable liability, we have to have a way of pricing the asset, and we would be therefore find ourselves facing the challenge of trying to assign a market value at 2013 levels to properties, for example, that have just been built. And we were not able to come up with a way that would be fair for doing that, or a way that would not be capable of sustaining challenge in terms of what is the yield that we are not gaining as a result of doing that. Currently, at the moment, it's around 25 to 27 million euro.
Okay, and final question, thanks, Chair. There is some sympathy, I think, on both sides of the House for, we'll say, the small landlord to be able to claim some tax back on property tax in order to maybe make their yield on a property a little bit more attractive. How would you see that applying now then, or would you see that applying to the cuckoo funds who are, either buying and the property developers who are applying to build massive amounts of build-to-rent property? So how would you square that circle? What's your view on that? Have you taken a view on that?
Well, of course, the person who pays the LPT is the property owner, as you well know. You don't need me to tell you that. But I would be careful about introducing LPT relief for landlords precisely because of the point that you have identified there, that it's very, very difficult to say that a tax policy measure can only be made available on the basis of scale, that if you're below a certain level, you can have it. If you're above a certain level, you can't. And this is one of the reasons why I have not brought in a number of tax measures that I was asked to do for the rental sector, because I was not able to come up, and there is not a robust way of saying that forms of tax policy can only be made available to a provider if you are below a certain level. It's not possible to do that, and for that reason I would be very surprised if we could find a way of adjusting LPT to take account of somebody who rents a property, for example.
Thank you very much, Deputy Lahart. Deputy Chambers.
Thank you very much, Chair. Minister, in relation to the local property tax, one of the biggest complaints I get from my own constituency in Mayo is that people feel it's a local tax and they expect to see local services for that tax. And the single biggest complaint is that they don't see any difference in local services since the LPT came into being. And I think you have a very difficult task on your hands in terms of making this an equitable tax, in terms of citizens actually seeing a return for the tax that they pay. And whatever way you find to try, and I have to say I would agree with Deputy McGrath's assessment that it doesn't really make sense that if there's going to be an increase for 80% of taxpayers in the LPT and only 20% will see a reduction, that local authorities will take in the same amount. I would like to see the methodology behind that, because it doesn't seem to make much sense. But take, for example, somebody in County Mayo who has a 3-bed semi-detached property, maybe valued at 130,000, possibly even less. They should be paying considerably less property tax than somebody living in maybe in a very affluent part of Dublin, perhaps Killiney or Howth, where the level of public services are much different. If you're living in rural parts of Ireland, there are no transport services really. Services that are available to you are much less. So I think until we address that feeling among citizens that they're not really getting anything back for the LPT, that it just goes into the state coffers and is spent on covering things like overruns in the Children's Hospital or the National Broadband Plan or whatever that may be, citizens are not seeing any tangible difference in provision of local services since the LPT came in. And there are some local authorities, and I'd like to hear your views on this, some local authorities are extremely cash-strapped, if I can use that term, running on deficits and struggling to provide basic services. And then you have other local authorities that have additional monies and can do lots of other things in terms of providing local services. So the variance between the local authorities in terms of the services that they can provide and the level of resources available to them is so widely different that I think, Minister, in terms of getting support for changes to the LPT, you'd need to address that issue.
So I take your point, actually, that we need to look at how we can, in the future, strengthen the link between the local property tax that somebody pays and actually the local services they receive. I think that's a fair point. Just so you're aware, Deputy, that in terms of how the LPT is currently allocated at the moment, of the approximately €500 million that we bring in each year, approximately €400 million of that is recycled back to local authorities to provide services. There is €100 million of that then is retained at central level, centrally. What I would like to do, and what I believe we can do, is find a way in which we can ensure that more of the tax that is raised within a particular area stays within the area. But the flip side of that equation is then we need to ensure that other local authorities do not lose out as a result of that. So we have to ensure that if a local authority that is currently receiving funds from elsewhere, we have to ensure they're not penalised as a result of that policy decision. And in parallel to bringing in the legislation to deal with this, I think part of the overall package of this would be that we make more progress on dealing with that. In relation to the point, though, that you make regarding a property, let's say in Mayo, versus a property in a very affluent part of Dublin, for example, of course, as you know, it is likely, though not certain, that the property in Mayo would be paying a lower LPT there anyway, just by virtue of the lower property value. But this debate cuts into the heart of issues that I will have to deal with when I present the legislation to the House, which is that because of the fact that property prices have grown at different levels, let's say in Mayo to other parts of the country, it does mean in any reform that we bring through, there will be different distributional consequences. You will see some people who will benefit from it, you'll see others who won't. But my net point is, the point that you and Deputy Breathnach have made, that I would like to see, and believe we can, as part of changing this, build a link between what you pay and what you retain and spend in your area. And I believe we can do it. And I think we will have to do that for some local authorities in order to ensure we have a successful revaluation.
Thank you. I just want to be clear that I'm not for a second advocating that somebody that has seen a significant rise in the value of their property in an affluent part of the country, they may not have access to liquid cash to actually pay extra bills. They may find themselves in a very difficult situation there. So, ability to pay has to be a factor regardless of, where you happen to have seen a massive increase in your property value. But would there not be an argument, Minister, that if 20% of the LPT, the local property tax, is being centralised, that is perhaps something that central government need to look at, because it's not very genuine to call it a local property tax if 20% goes back to central funds to be spent wherever government decides. And in a local authority such as Mayo, the ability of the elected members to vary the LPT, the 15% up or down, they don't really have that ability, because if there is a gap left, if they vary it downwards, that gap that is there will not be filled by central government. So in a very, I suppose, in a local authority where they have extra resources and where they're doing very well and they're in surplus and they have extra funds, they actually can give back to their citizens. They're more able to give back to their citizens. They can vary their LPT and see no negative impact on provision of services. But in a less wealthy area of the country, in parts of rural Ireland, there's really no ability to vary the LPT, because you leave a hole in the local authority finances, and that's probably the very same local authorities that are already cash strapped. And I've seen nothing from what you're proposing that seeks to address that significant imbalance across the regions, in particular in parts of rural Ireland, where the provision of services is far less than what you get in other parts of the country. And the LPT, the message I get back loud and clear is that it's not a fair tax, it doesn't stay local. I have not seen an improvement in my local services, and you will consistently get pushback until those issues are addressed. Thank you.
Just 2 points on what you said there, Deputy. The first one is you made the point that you think we need to give consideration to ability to pay in terms of the future LPT and what that would look like, and I could understand the attraction of that point and why you would feel that. But just to say legislating for that and changing the LPT to do that has massive consequences for what this tax will look like in the future and the revenue that it can raise. And this is one of the issues that we need to be careful about as we look at changing the revaluation and doing the legislation that we need in order to make that happen. In relation to your second point, in relation to the effect on local authorities that cut their LPT rate, what you said is correct, that if they cut the rate, and there's a gap in revenue as a result of cutting the rate, that gap is not filled up. But conversely, were we to decide that we will fill that gap up from central government, then we could perversely create an incentive for the rate to be reduced even further. And that is why there is, I believe, merit in ensuring in the future that local authorities, if they decide they're going to cut their LPT rate, they can only do that if they feel they have the resources in place to ensure that it's affordable for them. However, overall, the point that you have made regarding connection between paying a tax locally and seeing a service improve locally, I think that's a fair point. And in the press statement that I issued on the day, and I did it via press statement because it was only touched on in this report, because this report was looking at how we raise the tax as opposed to mainly how we spend it. I do think that is something that we would need to make progress on. Just to put a sense of the figures that are against that, currently we retain around €100 million per year in this tax. So making progress to that objective of what you pay locally is then paid in a service locally without penalising another local authority elsewhere does have significant financial consequences. But I think over time we'll be able to do a better job on it than we're doing at the moment.
Thank you very much, Minister. Next, Deputy Doherty.
Are we sticking on the LPT, or can we go wider, as you mentioned earlier on?
There's very little. Obviously, this is LPT.
Yeah, there's very little time. Okay, yeah. So look, I'll focus on the LPT, Minister. The report again, if you can give some clarity in terms of how come 80% are actually increasing. There'll be an increase in cost, even though the local authorities are supposed to remain the same amount of money. And maybe if I can give some insight into that, because if we look at scenario 1, which shows that 20% of householders would get a reduction and 80% would get an increase. But if you actually look at scenario 1, you would also see that every single local authority outside of Dublin City, outside of Dublin, would actually have a reduction in the amount of local authority or local property tax that would be collected. In that scenario, Minister, are you committing to make up the deficit to those local authorities if you decide to go with option 1?
First, in relation to your question there, in relation to option 2 regarding why there would be some who would lose, that is because of the movement of property values inside the local authority area. And maybe what I could suggest we do as the next step is my officials come in and take you through the detail of the model that has yielded that insight. And they were due to come in beforehand, but that wasn't possible for scheduling reasons because I was in here with you myself. In relation to your second question regarding if we were to go ahead with a particular yield, am I committing to making up yield that would be lost? That's not a commitment that I could give now, because what I want to do is ensure that overall the yield that we have at the moment is protected and maintained, and the way of increasing it in the future is by bringing new homes into the net.
Okay, but I think it's important when we're looking at scenario 1, I think it's important first because it's not really spelt out anywhere in the report. Every single county loses out, which means that there will be outside of Dublin, loses out to the tune of it'll be what Dublin benefits by 23 there, benefits by 1, benefits by, it's about, collectively it's about €40 million that will be stripped off from councils outside of Dublin, which means that services will have to be cut as a result of that unless the Exchequer is willing to fill that hole. So option 1 creates a major problem for local authority budgets who are already constrained, and I agree with Deputy Chambers' point. There is huge frustration that a local authority tax was come in, and on one hand a local authority was given the powers to raise these taxes, and on the other hand then the Exchequer funding of equal amounts was taken from the same local authorities. So this here would represent a very bad scenario for every single local authority outside the county of Dublin, yet this is under active consideration with no commitment to actually fill that gap.
Well, actually, Deputy, I haven't said yet which one of these scenarios I think we should go for. But if I say that I want to maintain the relative yield of the current LPT at the moment, the other side of that coin is the reason why I want to do it is because if the yield comes down, I know there will be revenue lost in local authorities that will then become an issue for me, because the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government will want that money to be found in other ways. And my view of what we will need to do is, as I said, protect the overall yield for people who are paying. And I think at this point, the way in which we will do it will be by a combination of band widening and rate adjustment nationally. And I believe by doing that, we will maintain the yield nationally. And by maintaining the yield nationally, I believe minimise and in fact hopefully eliminate any local authority losing revenue.
Okay, so you're saying your own view at this point in time, which I welcome you putting that on the table. And look, my own view in relation to the local property tax is well known by you. I believe it should be a completely different form where all assets should be included, but notwithstanding we're dealing with this review. So your position is that none of the 5 options that have been presented by the review group would be the option that you would choose. You would choose a variance of a number of those options.
I think a combination of scenarios 4 and 5 with some work offer a potential way forward on this issue.
Okay, it's very difficult then to, because we've got a review with 5 different scenarios showing exactly what every local authority would win and lose and all the rest, and none of them are actually, Deputy McGrath asked the question, what do you want from this committee? It's getting more bizarre as we speak, because if option 1 isn't on the table, then that's a different scenario. Let me go to the
just to be clear, from a process point of view, Deputy, I will be coming back into this committee and to the Oireachtas later on this year, hopefully, assuming we're all still here doing our work, making a recommendation about what to do. But if anything, this committee has indicated the fact that there is far more complexity in this issue than I think might have been initially apparent. Because the idea that you might be able to maintain yield, but individual taxpayers are unaffected, and that everybody will be unaffected, is very difficult to deliver.
Well, I
should also make one point, and I'm conscious that Deputy McGrath is leaving here. So, I'm in front of this committee this afternoon. I know other matters have been raised today about me and the performance of my department. I take the relationship that I have with this committee seriously. And while I know the Chairman has focused in these round of questions on LPT, if members want to raise some other matters with me, I think it's understandable that you do.
Yeah.
As I say this, I know I'm going to be causing all kinds of difficulties elsewhere, because I have an event that I have committed to doing this evening, but I do take my accountability to this committee seriously, and if members of the committee do want to raise other matters with me, I'll be in your hands.
Okay.
Indicate to the members that in the context of prioritising this area, that there would be some latitude if they wanted to ask you on what obviously our session 1 area was as well.
So let me make a final point on the LPT and then maybe go into that with the Fiscal Advisory Council's report. One is, before you make any determination in relation to your option, I believe that these type of modelling should be provided to the committee so that we would know actually the winners and losers and who would benefit and who would lose in terms from a local authority point of view. I think it's also important that you outline what is your position in relation to the retention of 100% and getting rid of the equalisation fund, and are you committed 100% to making sure that that 20% of the equalisation fund, which was shared to local authorities in more rural disadvantaged areas, will be maintained by Exchequer expenditure? On the Fiscal Advisory Council, Minister, the report was highly critical in relation to the budgetary stance. There's a table there, I'm sure you're well familiar with it, which shows the mid-term projections. The Fiscal Advisory Council have said for the 2nd time in a row they're unrealistic, they're not credible. They have again questioned the fact that you're not budgeting for the likes of the Christmas bonus, pointing out again health overruns, which we in this committee have discussed, and there's indications again we're going to see significant health overruns. But one of the biggest probably points that stick out is the fact that the department, yourself as Minister, haven't recognised the impact of the concentration and the impact of our dependence on corporation tax. In the previous document that was released by your department, it shows the impact not as high. It shows the risk is high, but not the impact is high. The Fiscal Advisory Council have questioned that. And given now that the concentration is more severe, 48% of all tax in this heading by 10 groups of companies, and the fact that it is now surging to what the Fiscal Advisory Council says that up to 3 to 6 billion of it may not be there in the medium term, is it now time to really look at the advice of the Fiscal Council in relation to medium-term expenditure and giving credible figures to us as a committee, to the Oireachtas and indeed the public, to look at a policy in relation to corporation tax surges of increases? And there also, you may be aware of their questioning of the design of the rainy day fund, which is counter-cyclical at this point, but is not counter-cyclical in a downturn, because it runs contrary to the fiscal rules to be able to use that for social protection payments or investment in health, education and so on and so forth, because it is limited in which ways it can be used. Thank you.
So, thank you, Deputy. To deal with your 4 points, number one, would I publish a schedule to allow you to see the distributional consequences of what I would propose doing? The answer to that question is yes. Number two, in relation to my commitment to ensuring that no local authority would lose out as a result of any change, that is my policy objective. I do want to ensure that if we move to a model in which some local authorities can keep revenue they raise within their own jurisdiction or within their own parameters, if I do that, and if we're able to do that, I also want to ensure that no other local authority loses out. Because at the moment, as you know, and we know how it works, through the Equalisation Fund, some local authorities, in fact many local authorities, receive flows of funding in from other local authorities, and I realise the importance of that. I would make the point, Deputy, that given that you have said that you will want to abolish the LPT in its entirety, that of course that would create a massive revenue loss for those local authorities, as opposed to anything that I am suggesting it would, Deputy.
Direct Exchequer funding, Minister.
Well, Deputy, well then in turn we will have to find that in turn then would create a revenue loss that will have to be filled up in another way.
Through a proper asset tax.
So with respect, Deputy, you can't be pointing to me about how I would deal with a revenue loss, given that you're looking to abolish the tax that proposes the revenue in the first place. In relation to what the Fiscal Advisory Council has said, firstly about the medium-term expenditure piece, what I would say in response to that is I'll give an example of public pay. If we were to outline now what we believe increases in public pay will be in 21, 22, 23, that will have a fundamental effect on what those figures are by the time we get to agree them with leaders of the unions with whom we negotiate those figures. If I begin to indicate now what social welfare packages are going to be in 2022 or 2023, that has a pretty big effect on the policy decision that the Minister of Social Welfare makes that day. And where I do have a difference with the analysis that IFAC have offered is I believe that if we were to go down that path with current expenditure modelling, it would eliminate policy discretion, by and large, for the government of the day in relation to where funding is allocated between different government departments. And I think we should relinquish that with care. In relation to your point in relation to corporation tax, other documents that my department have published have acknowledged that the concentration risk is definitely there in terms of corporation tax, in terms of a smaller number of companies paying a large share of that total tax head at the moment. But, Deputy, this is the reason why we increased VAT in the hospitality service, which you opposed, so that we could begin to broaden the tax base. This is the reason why we calculated our tax figures for this year on a lower level of corporation tax than we actually collected last year. So, yes, there is a vulnerability that could develop there in the future. But, Deputy, what commentators or institutions like IFAC would argue, which I agree with, is that we need to broaden the tax base. You were against all the ways to broaden the tax base, Deputy.
True. Minister,
that is true.
Minister,
So,
Minister,
Deputy,
Minister.
you want to abolish the local property tax. You were against water charges. You voted against the VAT increase. You voted against bringing up the levy on the betting sector. That's your track record.
Minister.
You're against those. And
Okay.
your one idea to raise revenue was to increase taxation and intellectual property and corporation tax policy. That's the very thing IFAC are warning against.
No, it's actually the very thing that Seamus Coffey has argued against, and you should be have argued for. Let me just finish on this. Yeah. Has been consistently arguing for, and you know you're wrong there, Minister. He has consistently argued and has been very critical of the fact that you have given an exemption in relation to intellectual property rights. You will also remember. You'll also remember that I was the person who argued for an increase in VAT, but it should happen in a two-step stage. I argued 1 year before you did it. I was the person who argued for an increase in betting, but not the way that you wanted.
Thank you very much.
There's always a reason to vote against these things, Deputy, and you've taken it at every opportunity.
No, that's not true.
I just want to restate for the members, to be absolutely clear, it's not that deputies do not have an opportunity to come back, but in the initial time period, if you do not use it all up, you have an opportunity to come back and reply to the Minister's comments, and there is a second round.
The Minister should correct the record in relation to IFAC's position on intellectual property rights, because the Minister knows he was wrong in relation to that.
Deputy Burton. Deputy Burton.
Thank you. I apologise. I had to leave the meeting earlier to have another engagement here. Can I just ask you about the page in the information sheets about exemptions and deferrals? I just want to understand where this is at. 49,000 claims for exemption in 2018. Am I correct in that the next line there says that's 11,700 requests for exemption for homes purchased in 2013? Is that correct? It's on the briefing sheet, the briefing on the review of the local property tax report.
Sorry, you're actually looking at a briefing document that was supplied by this committee to you.
Okay.
It wasn't supplied by the Minister or his thing, so I don't know. They wouldn't have seen that.
Okay. Well, there are a number of points on it. 49,000 claims for exemptions in 2018. So I just want to ask you, Minister, what are the categories of people who get exemptions? In particular, deferrals, I think we understand, are people on a particular income threshold and below it. But the exemptions, the numbers of exemptions dating back to the 2013 date, and the number of exemptions subsequently, and for what reasons, just broadly.
So the categories are for charitable bodies. Charitable bodies are public bodies that are providing special needs accommodation. Registered nursing homes, properties that have been vacated because of long-term mental or physical infirmity, the residence of a severely incapacitated person, properties that are fully chargeable to commercial rates, unfinished housing estates, properties where there's been significant pyrite damage, certain properties that have been purchased between the 1st of January 2013 and the 31st of December 2013, and then trading stock of builders that was unsold at the 1st of May or sold between 1 January and 31 October 2019.
Okay, so effectively, other than exemptions being granted for health, medical and particular circumstances and situations, how many houses at this point in time which were purchased or built are currently the subject of the exemptions?
It's on. So the total number of exemptions is 48,718.
Yeah. I just want to say, Minister, that I think it's a considerable cause of disaffection with the tax. The fact that significant numbers of people who bought their houses at this point quite some time ago are exempt. And it's a point that's constantly raised with me. Now, can I just ask you, if somebody buys, for instance, a new property, like, say, an apartment in the IFSC, let's say a penthouse apartment, maybe costing somewhere between 700,000 and maybe even $1 million, like we've all seen property prices in Dublin rising. if that's a new build and was a new build, say, 4 or 5 years ago, are we correct in, and this is the local legends that I'm talking about, are we correct in saying that that is exempt from property tax? That's the point I want to understand.
And the answer to that question is yes.
Yes.
That currently at the moment it is properties who were levied in when we last made the change in relation to this. But if a property like that is exempt, so is a property exempt that was purchased by somebody for €100,000, €150,000. They don't pay the local property tax either. But I want to finish this point. It's because it cuts both ways. And of course, as you know, the number of properties that have been bought at values below a penthouse apartment in the IFSC are considerably, there are far more properties who are below that property level and that value level than there are penthouses.
Yeah. But in this case, if I may say so, it's the exceptions where people know about these. People can see a new house, say, on the edge of Dundalk, that's maybe a 5-bed house, lovely house, and so on, and a lot more valuable, let's say, than the houses in Ann Street or some other street in Dundalk. And, you know, one property could be valued at 600, 700,000, the other maybe at 200, 250. But the people in the 250 house, because they've been there a long time, are paying the property tax, whereas the people in the new property or the purchased property are not. I'm just saying to you, in terms of the fairness of the incidence of taxation, I personally don't think that that is a situation that you can argue should continue indefinitely. I can understand with a new build and somebody taking on a fresh mortgage and so on, that you might give them 2 years exemption or something like that as they set themselves up. But I think it's really hard for people to understand this growing band. I would strongly suggest to you, Minister, for instance, something that would not interfere with the tax base, but that you could do immediately. And it might be a token, would be to actually apply even the minimum rate to those properties, so you wouldn't get caught up. I just think that's wrong.
Point very briefly, I'm not suggesting that the issue of exemptions in any way continues indefinitely. We do have to change it. The challenge that we have, Deputy, as I said to Deputy Breathnach earlier on, is I accept the inequity in relation to one property paying the tax and another not. But an equal inequity would then be charging one person a tax in the eyes of some at the basis of a 2019 property value and another one on the basis of a 2013 property value. And my view is that we deal with all of this in one go, and when the next revaluation happens, that everybody then pays the LPT on the basis of the market valuation at the same point in time.
Well, can I just say, Minister, this is a sore point with a lot of people that you talk to up and down the country because they can't understand it. And it speaks of a blatant unfairness. And I think you have to have the incidence of taxation as a central rule of taxation as fairly as possible, affecting equal in similar circumstances equally. The other question I want to ask you about...
You're out of time now, so literally you have a few seconds to ask that question.
I'd like to ask you, what is the situation in relation to the ongoing drama in relation to the appointment of the Governor of the Central Bank? Have you suspended the appointment? Have you stalled it? Or what is the situation? You've been silent on the matter. I think who runs the Central Bank is very important. Can we know what is happening?
Okay, that's completely obviously outside our area today, but...
The Minister did indicate he would invite.
I did indeed. So the incoming Governor of the Central Bank has now been appointed. He was appointed when government made the recommendation to the President to appoint him on the back of my recommendation, which followed a very independent and thorough process that yielded a single name at the end of it, which was Mr McGrath. I'm not going to comment at all on the inquiry that's underway in another jurisdiction because I don't believe it would be appropriate. There is work underway and an inquiry underway, and the New Zealand authorities have outlined what that is and when they're aiming to finish it by.
And can you give us an indication
Sorry,
of the
Deputy
finish
Burton.
date?
No, sorry, Deputy
When you're
Burton.
expected
No,
by?
yeah, but you are out
Sorry,
of time
I think this is an important.
in the same way.
We are the Budgetary Oversight Committee.
Yeah.
We've listened to the Fiscal Council
Yeah.
today.
Deputy Burton,
There's
sorry,
few people as important in the Irish system as the
Deputy
Governor
Burton, I'll just explain to you again. I'll let the Minister in briefly to finish, and then sorry, Minister.
The New Zealand authorities have indicated that they're aiming to have this inquiry complete by the end of June, but that is a matter for them, Deputy.
I just want to make it absolutely clear to all deputies that you have an opportunity after we've completed a round of questioning to come back. All you have to do is wait, and then you can come back in and follow up with the Minister as much as you'd like. Deputy Cowen.
Next. Sorry. Okay, in relation to the Fiscal Advisory Council, thankfully we have that forum available to us to independently and critically analyse the government's performance and the economy's performance, and also, since the last soft landing juncture, if you want to call it that, we have EU fiscal rules, we have departmental expenditure ceilings, none of which are complementary to the present scenario. We've exceeded departmental ceilings consistently. The Fiscal Council talks about the breach of the fiscal rules last year and again potentially this year. But it is quite damning and quite critical, and it focuses on a few key areas. And the first one we've spoken about briefly and you've responded to in relation to corporation tax receipts. And I take the point that you make, that you've allowed for a lesser receipts this time round. But that's not to say that you won't use it to bail out departments as you've done consistently in the past. Their volatility remains consistent. And what further analysis have you or your department carried out to measure that volatility in order to make a judgment on when it will cease to be such a comfort or safety net for the economy? The other issue it mentions obviously is in relation to Brexit, and the credibility of your forecasts, and much of that centres around the government assuming it will be a soft or arranged Brexit, but it would appear that it might be quite the opposite, and that can have a hugely detrimental effect on the economy and its performance, and ultimately other aspects of the economy thereafter. And it's unfortunate that you haven't factored that in, and that is maybe why they say some of the forecasts are unrealistic, they're not credible, they're irresponsible. But moving on to another point that I raised with them, and that was in the area of the National Development Plan. And if you take, for example, the overruns we've had in two areas of that already, in relation to the Children's Hospital, where there's another 350 odd million is to be provided for in the next 3 to 4 years, and no information yet as to where that will come from. You also have in excess of £1.5 billion in relation to the National Development Plan up to 2027, with another 400 million between 19 and 23 also. So that's the guts of 3 billion, we'd say, that you say will come from future revenues. They say in agreement with me that that's not necessarily credible, and it's unrealistic, and it's not fair, it's not being straight with the electorate. It obviously, in the absence of it, you say it won't leave any other projects foregone. There'll be no effect on any other single project in the development plan across the areas of health, across the areas of housing, across the areas of education and so forth. So, I would contend it has to come from higher taxes to pay for it. It has to come from new borrowings to pay for it. It has to come from current expenditure, or it has to come from cuts or projects foregone in the development plan. They're the four options that are available to you, but you say no. And they and I say it's not credible to say that's the case. How do you respond to that?
So just in relation to the different points that you've made, firstly, you allege, Deputy, that I've breached the fiscal rules.
I don't, they do.
No, I think you did, saying that I've breached the fiscal rules. Each of the budgets that I have done have been assessed by the European Commission as being compliant with our fiscal rules. But that being said, I remember sitting over where you're sitting, Deputy, and being assured that rules were being met. I have to do better than that, even though the rules are being met. So just to be clear, the European Commission that does assess the performance of the budgets that I have done vis-à-vis the fiscal rules of the European Union, have said they have complied. In relation to my breaching expenditure ceilings, more accurately, it would be the case that expenditure ceilings, mostly in relation to one or two departments, have been breached, and that is mainly centred around issues on health. To say that we have breached the ceilings for all government departments, particularly from a... No, but you said I breached government. You said I have breached government ceilings on a number of occasions. I am just stating what I have done. You then, thirdly, on the point on Brexit, and just to address that, in the SPU, we called out what would be the effect on our economy of a hard Brexit taking place. That is called out in the SPU. That was published in April. It's highlighted in a box in the SPU, in the Stability Programme update. Where, however, I think your point is important is that we have to acknowledge that circumstances are changing in front of our eyes at the moment. And what may have been the case earlier on in the year is now changing in front of us. And when I get to doing the summer economic statement, it is my intention to continue to outline what are the different scenarios that we might have to deal with later on in the year when we become clearer on what the form of Brexit will be. But the SPU does acknowledge the Brexit risk, but what I will be doing is spelling that out in more detail when we get to doing the summer economic statement. And then in relation to the views of IFAC in relation to the Ireland 2040 and the National Development Plan, I do believe that it will be possible over a number of budgets to meet the higher commitments that we will have for broadband and the National Children's Hospital. But I would make the point that broadband, that the National Children's Hospital in particular, does have additional costs that need to be paid for across the next 3 years, and then we will have paid for the National Children's Hospital and it will be in place.
116.
But I will need to acknowledge and outline on budget day what are the ways in which that will be paid for, and I will.
So it won't come from future revenues, as you said previously?
No, I've always said that there are a number of different ways in which it can be paid for. Yes, the future tax revenues that we collect are an obvious way in which it can be paid for, but there are other choices that we can make as well. I've always said that.
Including foregoing some of the projects that are listed in the National Development Plan.
But I haven't done that to date, Deputy. And
but you refuted that you would go down that road at all previously.
And my view is that we will be able to maintain other projects that we have in the National Development Plan. Earlier on this year, I was told that when we made the decision to pay for the additional costs from the National Children's Hospital without changing the capital ceilings, that would result in a variety of project cancellations. That has not happened.
Well, it has
but of course, Deputy, if earlier on in the year I had to increase the capital ceiling for the department, for the government overall, to pay for the additional cost of the National Children's Hospital, then I would now be facing a charge from IFAC and then no doubt yourself that we were increasing the total government capital ceiling to chase the cost of a project. And that's
exactly. But that's why it's important that you lay out over the next what will be cut to the tune of 116 million per annum over the next 3 years to pay for the Children's Hospital overall. But I think it's equally important that you not confine yourself to future revenue to pay for the overrun associated with the National Broadband Plan, because that's hugely excessive and will obviously have an impact on some projects if it's to be paid for in another form, and that is within the envelope that you have for the development plan.
As I said, I have demonstrated this year our ability to deliver the funding that has been needed for the National Children's Hospital without making changes elsewhere, and that is an approach that I am will, as I approach budget day, having outlined the resources that are available to us in the summer economic statement, I believe we will be able to continue with that approach, Deputy. And I believe that, particularly in relation to the National Broadband Plan, I've acknowledged that it is obviously a very, very costly and expensive project and was in front of this committee in relation to it. But I would make the point that at some point, those who are opposed to what we are doing will need to say how they would do it cheaper while delivering 100% coverage.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Deputy Ryan, you're up next.
Mr. Chair, so I've been in and out. There was a climate committee on that to attend. Mr. The Fiscal Advisory Council briefing earlier on was scary for any of us who've been over here long enough. The kind of stories they're telling again of I'll spend it because I have it economics and betting the future on stable tax revenues that might not realise is very familiar and very scary if some of the international downside risks bring us into financial difficulties again. I think there's a similar sense at the moment in our treatment of land, and that it's quite retro at the moment. We've got full-page ads in newspapers from developers telling us what's good for us in the form of development. We have Fine Gael relying almost entirely on the market to solve our housing problems, and clearly not working. Giving everything to developers in terms of lower standards and so on, and developers just storing land again and kind of playing the whole housing issue for their own interests. Will you consider, and this is part of the wider consideration of property tax, which I hope you might consider it in this regard, reintroducing the tax that we introduced in government, which put an 80%, I think it was, tax on any rezoning profits that would accrue to a landowner who benefits from that land being rezoned in any way. And I know the last government pulled this, arguing, oh, well, it had never raised any revenues, and sure, why would we have it? But actually, it's an important check against that improper speculative gains from land hoarding. And I believe it's at this time when we're starting, new development plans are starting, for example, in the councils, for any of the benefits of that to accrue to developer is completely improper, and it might put some manners on the developers a wee bit if they don't see it as that speculative asset that is worth hoarding. Secondly, with regard to the Land Development Agency, will you give it powers, or are you considering giving it stronger powers in terms of compulsory purchase order? In my mind, we need to build up bands to achieve the objectives of the National Planning Framework, which I agree with. The National Development Plan abandoned it. It's totally unsustainable, but the original planning framework was very good. And its kind of desire to bring life back to the centre. For example, my own city in Dublin, you might see the Land Development Agency looking at possibly compulsorily purchasing land that may be in brownfield or in industrial states that could, if developed in conjunction with other state assets, make for a very effective development. Will we give the Land Development Agency those sort of CPO powers? Will we introduce in a way where, again, it's just not just a massive benefit profit going to the landowner in question? In other words, that it's not because of the state's actions, the upside from that shouldn't go necessarily to the landowner we'd be CPOing from, but should accrue back to the state. And are you looking at this in terms of the powers that we'll give the Land Development Agency? And just thirdly, in regard to property tax, and I have my own views on the domestic property tax, but I think sometimes we always focus on that and miss the bigger picture of the capital asset of land hoarding from the speculative market is actually a core part of the problems we have in our housing problem. Is there another way in which you can think, or are you looking at strengthening the ability of the state to recoup land benefits that accrue from developments, let's say for the example the Metro, where we cite development levies and other mechanisms to bring it back? How are you looking at that as a third mechanism to try and evening up the score, that we're not just a developer-led country, that it's actually public good-led property management?
So, in relation to the different points, firstly, what you have, your assessment of where we stand from an IFAC point of view, on the basis of what you heard earlier on, I would make the point back, Deputy, to ask that you give consideration to changes that we have made in broadening the tax base to try to deal with the very risk that you are identifying. Over the last 2 budgets, the tax base has been broadened, despite the fact that the sectors of our economy whom are affected by the tax broadening have not wanted it. That has happened precisely because I am trying to find ways of ensuring that over time we do not become reliant on a particular tax head or excessively reliant. And you know what they are. You know what we've done in stamp duty and commercial property. You know what we've done with VAT. You know what we've done, for example, though it's on a smaller level, with what is happening on the gambling and betting sector. Those changes have all happened. In relation to your second question, am I looking to give additional powers to the Land Development Agency? That's a matter for Minister Murphy, though I am working with him on it. And my view is that the Land Development Agencies should have strong powers in relation to CPOs, because I believe that is important for allowing them to build up a land bank, which of itself is value for building homes on, but I also believe will have an important indirect effect then on the pricing of other land that is adjacent to those land banks. In relation to your third question, am I looking to bring in the kind of additional zoning tax that you referred to earlier on? I'm not planning to do that at the moment, Deputy. The reason for that is I'm trying to increase the supply of zoned land at the moment. And my concern is if I was to make a change like that, that could run against that objective. Where I differ with you on, Deputy, is it is not the case that we are reliant on the market to deliver the objectives that we have for housing. Yes, we do need private developers to deliver private homes for those who want to buy them. But between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 homes that are going to be delivered for this year are going to be delivered through different mechanisms by the state for social and public use. That's mixed use. And then finally, briefly, sorry, just in relation to your final point there about the, what was Deputy, was in relation to another tax?
In relation to the tax on rezoning profits that comes from a rezoning decision? Development levies.
That's your final point, with your development levies. At this point in time, it's not something that I am considering doing, but I am engaging with the Department of Housing in relation to how we can make sure that we are funding infrastructure in the right way, but also looking at how we can make sure that nobody is benefiting disproportionately from the delivery of a public good in their vicinity.
Just if I can, Chair, just to clarify, so you're saying in an instance where there's agricultural land, let's say it's valued about €10,000 an acre, a public body makes a decision to rezone it for, let's say, residential, where it might go up in value to 2, 3, 4, 500,000, whatever an acre, depending on the location. That kind of 300,000 or 400,000 an acre profit should go to the developer, the owner of that land, not as Judge Kenny back in the original Kenny judgment 40 years ago, or I think any other, certainly from my perspective. Why does the landowner deserve to retain all that profit from what's a public good decision that's nothing to do with the inherent? Why would we continue to agree to that? And if it's been done, as you say, to kind of encourage supply of zoned land, have we not seen the folly of those ways over 40, 50 years, the corruption it brings?
Thank you, Deputy. You're out of time, and I've given you that extra leeway. I'm going to let the Minister back
Deputy,
in.
My understanding, though, is that in normal circumstances, that landowner would then pay capital gains tax.
At what percent?
But they are paying capital gains tax, though.
A low percent.
Well, it is low as a percentage, in percentage terms, as a percentage of the total value of the property. But to suggest they're not paying tax, they are. They're paying capital gains tax. And the trade-off to what you're saying there, Deputy, is I also want to ensure there's more land available upon which we can build more homes, trying to get the balance right. I am not making this policy choice because of a desire to necessarily protect private gain. I'm doing it to try to ensure that we are in a situation where we have more zoned land. I mean, would you accept that if we were to introduce the measure that you're proposing, that we would reduce the incentives for making land available for homes?
I think I've used up those CPO powers, and anyway, the zoning decisions are made by the public services, not on the basis of land interests, which is what's happened in this country over the years.
Thank you, Deputy. Minister, I'm going to have to...
Just to make the point, that has a big policy consequence as well, very, very big. Because in essence what you are saying then is, I think you're accepting my assumption that if we were going to introduce a tax measure like that, it would reduce the ability to make land available for additional homes. Your answer to that question then is that we would CPO it. That is something that would have really big consequences for current landowners. I believe we can get the balance right in terms of encouraging the supply of more land in the future for the zoning of more homes without being reliant on the measure that you're proposing there.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I had indicated to Deputy Chambers, I know we're supposed to be finished in 3 minutes, but Deputy Chambers, I know you wanted to come back in with a question to the Minister there. Yeah,
thank you very much, Chair, for your indulgence, and I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question beyond the LPT. Minister, just a brief question on the IFAC report that we've all been discussing in relation to Brexit. And I think it made for quite sobering reading in terms of the potential impact of a no-deal Brexit, which is more possible now than it ever has been. And you're right, it is changing by the hour, by the day. But Seamus Coffey was in here earlier with his team, and part of the report states that a significant fiscal adjustment will be required and significant spending cuts or tax increases to stop Ireland's debt ratio from spiralling in the event of a hard Brexit. I asked the question, what level of adjustment would be required in the event of a no-deal Brexit, say from 2020 onwards? His response was a €4 billion adjustment in 1 year, and over a 3-year period you could broaden that out to €5 billion. A significant adjustment could be required in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Minister, my question is, have you done any planning around how you might cope with such a significant adjustment to the public finances in the space of 1 year, maybe next year? Has your department done anything in terms of addressing the impact of the fluctuations in sterling? Even today it's up on nearly 90 pence to the euro, and that's already having an impact on businesses. And I think there was an assumption that it may actually level back off down to 85, but actually it's up at 89 point something now, nearly 90 pence, and that's having an impact as we speak. And we have a table here in front of us that's provided by Secretariat, but it's based on IFAC's report. Just looking at the baseline scenario for the budget balance, compared then with the ESRI projections and the Central Bank of Ireland projections, and the two vary. Actually, the Central Bank forecasts are far more miserable, if I can put it that way. But the ESRI forecasts in the event of a hard Brexit are equally as distressing and concerning. But it does show that in the event of a hard Brexit, if we take 2020, instead of having a surplus of 0.6% of GNI, we could be looking at a deficit of minus 4.7 on the central bank case, and even a slightly better minus 2.3, the ESRI projections. If we track forward to 2022 and 2023, it's the same level of forecasting in that we had hoped for a surplus in those years on the baseline scenario. We're looking at a deficit now of, at best, minus 0.4 and at worst up to minus 2.8. 2022 and 2023 are the 2 years that you have identified that will require the most significant spending for the National Broadband Plan. If there is a hard Brexit, I think that would make that level of spending for that particular capital investment almost impossible. And I'd like to hear your views on that, Minister.
Okay. In relation to your points about the short-term and then medium-term effect of Brexit on the national finances, I published an estimate of this earlier on in the year, and I did indicate in that estimate that the effect of it would be significant. I did indicate at that point that it would mean that the surpluses that we have now begun to run and would run at a higher pace in the future will be affected and will be affected considerably, and will move our national finances back into a deficit position. And I will be outlining our views of what that will therefore mean for our ability to make choices in the future, because I want everybody to be aware of this. In relation to does how we would need to then think about parts of our economy that need support. What I will say to you is that overall at the moment, the Brexit situation is now changing, and we need to be aware of that for what that might mean for us later on in the year, as we're seeing the different debates that are underway in the British political system. And if we get into a hard Brexit scenario, that will mean the government will need to put in place forms of support for different parts of our economy and then pay for it. In relation to your question about the National Broadband Plan, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on that now, because I'm only at the place where I'm going to be outlining resources that may or may not be available. But I'll just say two things to you for debate, I'm sure, throughout the year. The first one is that if we do get into a hard Brexit scenario, the parts of our country that could be most affected by this are also parts of our country that will most rely on broadband connectivity in the future. And secondly, for those who believe that there is a cheaper or different way of doing this, at a point in time, you're going to have to outline what that is. Because I went through that process for the best part of a year in terms of trying to identify it. But at this point in time, all we will be doing soon is begin to identify what would be the different resource consequences of what we would need to deal with within a hard Brexit.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, I know we're over time, but if you would bear with, I have a couple of questions which I wanted to ask you in conclusion in relation to the LPT. One of them is in relation to the committee's work on looking at the thing. There's widespread discussion all the time in terms of the yield and everything else, and a constant discussion about property price increasing. How, in terms of looking at the scenarios, dealing with a property price crash, what work has been carried out in relation to that in terms of yield and the protection of yield from the LPT? So if you're looking at a funding model for local government, if we had the situation that we went through from type of 08 through 2010, how in relation to that would we look at that? I don't know if that has been done or whatever, but I think it is important in terms of our work as a committee in feeding into it. The other thing, in your opening remarks, you made a reference to a willingness to look at the situation in relation to managed estates and to management fees that people would pay. You also made an opening comment in relation to the general principle of preserving the LPT and not going into exemptions, derogations or various type of offsets against it. I just think that from the experience I have as public representative in Dublin, and a lot of people who pay their property tax in Dublin pay a lot of property tax. Contrary to the notion you can only have the snow cleared once, or you can only have the footpaths repaired, you can only have various things done by a council at one particular point. There's an awful lot of people living in non-managed estate areas who pay an awful lot of property tax. And I just wonder where your thinking is on this idea that, most property tax, if it's kept locally and spent locally, will be spent in the greater good of the community. And if somebody's living in a £700,000 apartment paying X property tax, they're paying a management fee, yes, but they're getting the benefit of the management fee in terms of the preservation of their immediate vicinity. Somebody's living in a £700,000 house in a large housing estate paying an awful lot of property tax, and they're going to be paying more. And yet they'll have to they might be paying their residents' association fees and whatever. I'm just wondering where the equity is in that type of proposal and why you would look at it.
So, sorry, Deputy Chairman, if I could just make sure I understand your question. Are you talking about the particular issue of management fees, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I said in the report, and I said on the day the report was launched, that I am aware of the interest in the Oireachtas and looking at this issue. One of the things that I would be aware of, though, Deputy, is that for those who are in properties or in homes or apartments who are paying management fees, they are also more than likely in receipt of services that are supplied by the local authority as well. And we need to assess, the contribution that they make in light of that. So currently, if you are in a home, let's say a house in an estate that has a management fee, either directly or indirectly, you'll also be benefiting from what your local authority provides as well. And we do need to ensure that we need to assess and look at how we can find a way in which that homeowner also makes a contribution to the provision of those public services as well.
Okay. That other point about looking at the models in terms of a property price decrease.
Actually, from the work that we have done, we have our modelling is based on the price at which the properties move to remaining unchanged, and the yield therefore is coming off an unchanged price. We have neither assumed continued inflation into the future or a deflation at that point. So what we have said, maybe to explain it better, is we have said that a property will go from a price point now to a price point in the future, and we haven't assumed that that price point will either go up or go down after that. But maybe in the work that we're going to have to do in advance of bringing in the legislation to keep this tax and reform it, that's something that we can deal with the committee on.
Okay, thank you very much. Minister, can I thank you on behalf of the for the time that you and your officials have given to us today. We very much appreciate that. It has been a long city day for our committee. With that, I'm going to bring our meeting to a conclusion. We are now going to stand adjourned until Tuesday the 18th of June at 1:30 p.m. Thank you.